Hello, and welcome to this clean historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. The Bride's Good Deed by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1. Roxbury, Boston, late 1880s. Molly, have you finished yet? Hurry up and we can go for a break. Hester's urgent whisper made Molly Larkin jump, and she almost dropped the cloth she was using to blacken the grate in the dining room. Glancing around, she saw Hester's cheerful face in the doorway. "I've told you not to sneak up on me that way, Hester. Last time I tripped over the ash bucket, and Mrs. Chapman gave me a proper telling off." Molly hastily swiped the cloth over the final section of the grate and then stood up to survey her handiwork. Above their heads, they could hear the Chapmans beginning to stir, but she and Hester had already been hard at work for several hours. "If we're quick, Cook might let us have our breakfast before the family comes downstairs." Hester hurried away toward the kitchen, and Molly hastily tidied her rags and polish away. After working for Miriam and Henry Chapman as one of their maids for over 10 years, she knew better than to leave any trace of the tools of her trade behind. A good maid should be all but invisible, Miriam Chapman had declared to her well-to-do friends at high tea just last week, just as Molly had whisked their empty cups away. Miriam had given Molly a reproachful stare as the teacups rattled slightly on the tray as Molly edged out of the room. "I have to say, it does seem to be getting harder and harder to employ good staff, but I expect only the highest standards. Nobody is irreplaceable," she had added. It had been loud enough so that her words drifted after Molly to serve as a warning, and she had been on her best behavior ever since. "I hope you're going to wash your hands before you touch anything in here." Mrs. Mallory, the cook, jerked her head toward the scullery at the sight of the black smudges on Molly's hands. "And make sure you give them a proper scrub. I don't want any of that muck on my napkins." "It's us who does the washing anyway," Hester replied. "Why are you so grumpy this morning?" She poured out 3 cups of coffee and fetched a couple of bowls from the large dresser. "It's this dinner party that's got me all flustered," Mrs. Mallory said with a shake of her head. "Mrs. Chapman said it's very important that everything is perfect. They've got important people coming to it, something to do with the mill. Right when Betty decides to get married and leave too," she added with an irritated sniff. "That girl has no thought for anyone but herself." Molly ladled out porridge for herself and Hester. "We'll be helping you, or maybe Mrs. Chapman might find a new scullery maid to replace Betty for you." Gloria Mallory sat down heavily in the large chair at the head of the scrubbed wooden table, glad to rest her aching legs. She sipped her coffee with a gloomy expression. "I had Betty trained up exactly how I like things done. I won't be able to do the same with a new girl in the space of a couple of weeks, will I? It's very inconvenient." "You can't blame her for falling in love. In fact, I quite fancy falling in love myself," Hester said with a mischievous grin. Gloria gave her a look of alarm. "I hope you ain't serious? You know Mrs. Chapman doesn't encourage her maids to start courting. She likes everyone to concentrate on their work, not have their heads in the clouds thinking about young gentlemen." Hester pouted and tossed her hair by way of reply, making Molly giggle. The 2 girls had been firm friends ever since Molly had first arrived at the Chapman residence over 10 years ago, although their backgrounds were very different. Hester's parents had emigrated from Germany, and her pa worked at one of the breweries at Stony Brook, whereas Molly had come straight from the orphanage into service just before she turned 11 years old. All she knew about her own family was what matron had told her on the day she left, that her ma was of Irish descent and had left her at the orphanage at a tender age when she could no longer take care of her. Her ma had apparently died a few days later, and nobody knew anything about her pa. Having no parents or the safety net of other relations had always made Molly feel an emptiness at her core, which made her long to have a loving husband and children of her own one day. "But it's so romantic, falling in love," Hester sighed. "You'll be the death of me. Are you fraternizing with young men? Why can't you be more like Molly? She's got a nice, sensible head on her shoulders." Hester rolled her eyes, but it was a good-natured exchange. She was the one who liked to tease Cook and the other servants, whereas Molly could always be relied on to pour oil on troubled waters, taking care to help the younger servants feel they always had someone they could talk to. Now that they were both 21 years old, Cook knew it was only a matter of time before they started courting, and she tried to dispense cautionary words of advice to make sure they didn't attract the wrong kind of attention. She had already noticed how the delivery boys liked to flirt with Hester, who tossed her blonde curls, lapping up the attention. But Molly was more reserved. Her blue eyes and wavy copper-colored hair meant that she was a natural beauty, but she seemed unaware of the way heads turned to admire her when they walked to church on a Sunday. "You can't expect us to devote our whole lives to the Chapmans," Hester grumbled. She scraped the last spoonful of porridge from her bowl, gulping it down at the same time as reaching for a slice of bread and butter. "We're grateful to work here, though," Molly added hastily. "Nora was telling me at church how lucky we are compared to her work at the factory. The bad air there affects her lungs something terrible." Mrs. Mallory stood up again, having finished her coffee. Her thoughts were full of plans for the upcoming dinner party, and she waddled off to the pantry with her recipe book. She needed to start making a list of what she would need to make the dishes Mrs. Chapman had chosen for the 6-course menu. "I think Freddie has taken a shine to me," Hester whispered to Molly once they were alone. "I saw him loitering out the back while you were in the dining room. He picked me a rose." "What, from the garden?" Molly blanched at the thought. "Don't let Mrs. Chapman find out. She's sacked people for less, and you know she's a stickler for honesty. She might think you stole it." "You worry too much," Hester said casually, waving her hand. "The head gardener told Freddie he could have it, and I smuggled it up to our room under my apron." Her face took on a dreamy expression. "Ever since Betty knew she was getting married, it's made me wonder about us too, Molly. Will you and I ever walk out with a nice beau? Watching her fall in love was ever so romantic. What I wouldn't give to have a couple of gentlemen vying for my attention." Molly gave her a sideways glance, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. "You already have Freddie chasing you. How many more would you like?" she asked with a chuckle. "Well, you're a fine one to talk. I've seen the way Henry looks at you when he thinks Mrs. Chapman isn't watching." "Henry? Don't be so silly." Molly spluttered. "You know Henry and I have been friends since we were children. There's nothing more to it than that." Molly gathered their dirty dishes and took them to the scullery, scrubbing them vigorously while she considered what Hester had just said. Henry was Miriam and George Chapman's youngest son, the only one of their 4 grown-up children still living at home. The idea that he might have romantic feelings toward her was ludicrous, she told herself. Hester's letting her mind run away. It's not like that with me and Henry. Her thoughts drifted back to when she had first arrived at the large, elegantly proportioned house at Wyndham Street. She had scarcely seen the family to begin with, because she had started as the scullery maid and mainly stayed in the kitchen. But after she had been there for about a year, Henry had contracted a nasty chest infection that the doctors had struggled to cure. They insisted on him staying in bed to escape the worst of the harsh winter weather. But days had turned into weeks, and he had languished under his quilt, looking as though he would never recover. It seemed as though the only thing that cheered him up was when Molly was sent to empty the ash and light a new fire in his bedroom. He would perk up and chat with her about the latest book he was reading. Seeing how Molly's company lifted Henry's spirits, Mrs. Chapman had promptly employed a new scullery maid and promoted Molly to a housemaid position, telling her to take care of everything to do with Henry's room. Over the next few months, their friendship had blossomed, and Henry had gradually regained his health. But he doesn't think of me in that way, surely? Now that the thought had become lodged in her mind, Molly realized that Henry had been somewhat over-attentive recently, but she had put it down to him being bored after another bout of illness had kept him indoors. All these years later, he had a weak chest, and it didn't take much for him to become unwell again. A few minutes later, Molly hurried along the upstairs landing, pausing only to look quickly in the mirror to make sure her apron was straight and her hair was neatly contained in its demure bun. Mrs. Chapman had been on the warpath recently about the maids looking tidy, and she didn't want to give her any cause to find fault, especially as her copper curls had a habit of escaping her bun if she had been too busy to check. The clock chimed the hour, and Molly slipped into the small linen room where the freshly laundered sheets were stored for ease of being near the family's bedrooms. She had been instructed to make up one of the guest bedrooms for Mrs. Chapman's sister, who was coming to stay, and she picked up a pile of sheets and pillow slips, enjoying the faint scent of lavender on them from where she had pressed them the day before. "Aha! There you are, Molly." Henry's cheery voice behind her made her smile with pleasure. He had been away for a few days, and she had missed his company. "How was your trip? Did you meet all the people from England?" She smiled up into his gray eyes, blushing as she suddenly noticed her was looking at her with a rather intense expression. "Oh, lots of shaking hands and business talk." Henry folded his arms and leaned against the doorframe with a wry grin. "I'm glad to be home again, to be honest. I don't mind working in the family business, but I do find the meetings rather tedious. Have I missed anything interesting? Your aunt is coming to stay." Molly lifted the bundle of sheets higher. "Budge out of my way. I need to clean the guest bedroom and make up the bed, otherwise your ma will be after me for dawdling." She went to squeeze past Henry, but he laid his hand on her arm to stop her. "Don't rush off, Molly. I enjoy our chats. I sometimes wish we could go back to when we were children and there were fewer demands on us. Do you remember?" "Speak for yourself, Henry Chapman," Molly said with a sudden giggle that made her eyes sparkle. "While you were recuperating in bed, I was fetching coal, making your fire, and dusting your room, if that's the time you're referring to?" He gave her a good-natured smile in return. "You're right. I think of you as a friend first and a maid second, or not at all, if I'm honest." He sighed wistfully. "I just wish that things could be different." His words trailed off, and he shuffled his feet. "If you weren't a maid, Molly..." There was something about the intensity of his expression that brought the blood rushing to Molly's cheeks. He was looking at her differently, as though she was more than a friend. "Well, I am a maid," she mumbled quickly. "I have to go, Henry." She wriggled past him, but his arms shot out again, and he spun her around. "I have feelings for you, Molly," he suddenly blurted out. "I thought going away for a few days would show me it was just a passing fancy, but seeing you again has merely confirmed in my mind that it's not." Molly gasped and pulled away. You can't say that, Henry. I'll lose my job if anyone finds out." She stumbled toward the guest bedroom and slammed the door behind her, turning the key in the lock so she could be alone with her whirling emotions. Hester was right. How could I not have seen it? The thought was both shocking and also rather thrilling. It was as if the scales had fallen from her eyes, and she realized that Henry was no longer the gangly boy who was her childhood friend, but a good-looking man who had confessed he had romantic feelings for her. "What am I going to do?" she whispered. She sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling shaken. She had heard far too many stories of maids being led astray by the men they worked for, and it never ended well. Chapter 2. Roxbury, Boston. The day of the dinner party dawned fair, and Molly and Hester were up an hour earlier than usual at Mrs. Mallory's request. Although most of the food had been prepared over the preceding few days, the lack of a scullery maid had left them short-handed. The glasses need polishing, and the silverware needs cleaning. Mrs. Mallory's face was already pink with exertion by the time Molly had finished a hasty breakfast. She propped the kitchen door open to allow the cool morning air in, although the heat from the range was already making the kitchen hotter than usual. Hester fanned herself with a tea towel. "I hope they let us have an extra hour off on Sunday for all this palaver," she muttered. "Mrs. Chapman did say she would consider it if the dinner party goes well." The aroma of fresh fruit filled the room as Mrs. Mallory assembled her ingredients to make her famous cherry pie, which was Henry's favorite. She'd had a soft spot for him ever since his childhood illness and always endeavored to give him more food than everyone else, even though he was now a strapping young man, much to Molly's amusement. Molly laid all the cutlery out on a tray and made short work of polishing it until she could see her reflection in it. "I'll take this through to the dining room and lay up the table, shall I?" Cook nodded. "And when you've finished, Mrs. Chapman wants you to get the fresh flowers from the gardener so she can arrange them. You know she always likes to do that herself." Molly hurried to the dining room, casting a critical eye over the way it looked. She had dusted and polished all the furniture the day before, and the faint scent of beeswax polish still lingered in the air. It would be replaced with the heady aroma of damask roses once Mrs. Chapman had arranged the flowers. She glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. She would have to hurry if she was to lay the 12 place settings in time to take breakfast in bed upstairs for the family. The soft sound of footsteps alerted Molly to someone coming into the room. "Have you been avoiding me?" Henry asked. His voice was quiet, but there was an urgency in his tone that told her he wanted an answer. "I've hardly seen you in the last 2 weeks, and there's so much I want to tell you." Molly sighed. There was no point trying to fob him off with excuses. He knew her too well and would see straight through them. "We've all been busy preparing for tonight, but yes, I guess I have been avoiding you as well." "I didn't mean to scare you off by declaring my feelings, Molly." Henry strode across the room and seized her hands. "Won't you at least tell me how you feel about what I said? My mind can't rest until I know." "I don't know, Henry. I've never allowed myself to think of you as anything other than a good friend. But really, I shouldn't even do that. You're my employer. One day, you might be master of the house, and I'm your maid." Looking up into his familiar gray eyes, Molly felt confused. She loved him, but was it in a romantic way? She had never been in love, so she wasn't sure. Betty had spoken of feeling as though her heart would leap out of her chest when she was courting her beau. But Molly didn't feel like that. Henry smiled down at her. "I don't want to worry about stuffy rules like that. You're very beautiful, Molly, and I can't stop thinking about you." "Well, it's kind of you to say so." Molly slipped out of his grasp and hurried around the table to put some space between them, adding the last few pieces of cutlery to the final place settings. Henry threw himself into one of the chairs and drummed his fingers on the table. "I thought you'd be pleased." He sounded frustrated by Molly's cautious reply. "I'm flattered and a little confused is all." "It's all very well you saying your feelings have changed, but what do you expect from me, Henry? I value our friendship more than anything, but we can't be together, and you know it. Your parents would never allow it." "But won't you let me love you, Molly?" Henry jumped up again. "I'm a grown man. Mama can't dictate who I fall in love with." Molly shook her head with a wry smile. "Your ma has been trying to introduce you to all manner of suitable young ladies in high society, Henry Chapman, and you know it. Whatever you feel for me is just a passing fancy." Her expression suddenly became more serious. "I can't be anything more than a maid and a friend to you, and please, I beg of you to think of my position. I can't afford to lose my job in service. I like working here. You have to promise your ma will never find out about this, Henry. I'm not a woman of loose morals. We just have to remain as friends, and that's all." "I think you underestimate me," Henry replied stoutly. "Just you wait and see. I'll prove I love you, and Mama can't do anything about it." Henry hurried away, but not before Molly had seen the determined glint in his eye. He'd always had a stubborn streak when he didn't get his own way, and her mind swirled with worry that he might do something rash that would jeopardize her position and leave her without a job or a roof over her head. The rest of the day was so busy that Molly pushed Henry's conversation to the back of her mind. There would be time enough to think about it as soon as the dinner party was over. The first course was to be served at 6 o'clock, and half an hour before, Mrs. Chapman swept into the kitchen to give everyone her final instructions. "I want you in your best uniforms, girls, and I'd like to remind you just how very important it is that the dinner goes well. The guests are very important to Mr. Chapman's business. Plus, Mrs. Defoe and her daughter Amelia will be joining us. Molly, please make sure that Amelia Defoe is seated next to Henry. Hester jabbed Molly in the ribs as soon as Mrs. Chapman had swept back out of the kitchen. Don't worry about Henry falling in love. He's been mooning about after you like a lovesick puppy these last few days. He keeps pestering me to find out where you are. What's that you're gossiping about? Mrs. Mallory frowned. I do hope you're not making eyes at Master Henry, Molly. He's head over heels in love with her, Hester said mischievously. Anyone with eyes in their head can see it. Stop it, will you? Molly felt suddenly tearful and turned her back on them, busying herself with arranging teacups on a tray while she took back control of her emotions. The situation was feeling dangerously out of hand already, and she felt a ripple of anxiety as she saw Mrs. Mallory's expression darken. Has he been making advances on you, dear? I've been worried this might happen. Molly hesitated and then gave a small nod. I don't know what to do, cook. He's so persistent, and I'm terrified I might lose my job if the mistress finds out. I promise I haven't encouraged him. I thought we were just friends. Just be polite, but keep your distance. That's my advice. Mrs. Mallory sucked her cheeks in and leaned closer, lowering her voice. Between you and me, dear, Mrs. Chapman is hoping Henry and Amelia Defoe will be courting before the month is out. So go about your work, and I'm sure this will all blow over in no time. Molly gave her a grateful smile. It was the sort of worry she would have taken to her ma, but Mrs. Mallory knew she didn't have that option and tried to guide her where she could. Thank you. I hope you're right. The dinner party was soon in full swing, and in spite of her earlier worries, Molly couldn't help but enjoy seeing the family and their guests in their finest clothes. The conversation ebbed and flowed around the table as she discreetly served each course with Hester. Henry cut a dashing figure in the new suit his ma had made by their tailor, and she could tell that Amelia was very taken with him by the way she looked up at him with a rapt expression every time he spoke. After dessert was served, Mrs. Chapman took the female guests to her parlor so the gentlemen could smoke cigars and drink brandy as they discussed business matters. Bring some more coffee, Mr. Chapman said, looking in Molly's direction. You'll have one before you leave, Gregory, won't you? The guest of honor nodded. He was looking a little bleary-eyed from a few too many brandies, and Molly scurried away, knowing that cook would already have a pot of fresh coffee made ready for just such a request. Molly, wait. As she hurried away, Henry pounced from the shadow of the library doorway. His cheeks were flushed from the wine he'd had with his meal, and he slipped his hand around her waist, pulling her toward him. I've been stuck with that dreadful Amelia all night, but all I wanted to do was get away and see you. Get off, Henry. This isn't right. Molly wriggled free, not knowing whether to be cross with him or flattered by his persistence. Oh, come on, Molly. We understand each other. You're the only person I can really be myself with. I know Mama wants Amelia and I to start courting, but how can I when my heart already belongs to you? Molly giggled. You're being silly. We're just friends, remember? No, Molly, you're more than a friend. He grasped her wrist and pulled her close again, kissing her firmly on the mouth. See? Henry grinned as she pulled away. I'm going to tell Mama that I'm not interested in Amelia. No, you mustn't. Henry, are you coming to join us? Amelia would like to play the piano for you. Mrs. Chapman's voice drifted down the hallway, making Molly gasp with terror at the thought that they had been seen. I have to go. She snatched her wrist back and scurried toward the kitchen, not daring to look back over her shoulder. Coming, Mama? Henry whistled cheerfully as he strolled toward the parlor looking a picture of innocence. Chapter 3. Roxbury, Boston. Molly jumped at the sound of Mrs. Chapman's voice outside the kitchen. Almost 2 weeks had passed since the dinner party, and every time she heard her mistress, she wondered whether she was about to get the sack. She didn't think her nerves could take much more, even though Mrs. Mallory had taken her to one side and reassured her it was all a storm in a teacup. Ah, Molly, could you help cook prepare a picnic for luncheon today? I'm chaperoning Henry and Amelia for an outing to the park. Mrs. Chapman gave Molly a pointed look. They're officially courting now. She will make the most delightful daughter-in-law, and not before time either. Make sure the food is exquisite, please. You've been a bit slapdash recently, and I won't stand for it." "Yes, ma'am." Molly bobbed her head and scuttled to the pantry to fetch the picnic baskets, hoping that the blush on her cheeks wasn't too obvious. "Do you think she knows that Henry forced a kiss on you?" Hester whispered as soon as Mrs. Chapman had left the room. I don't know." Molly felt wretched. She had hardly slept for the last few nights, wondering whether she did indeed have feelings for Henry after all. Now that he had started courting Amelia, she felt hurt that he had been presumptuous enough to kiss her and then just cast her aside. She wished they had stayed purely friends, as she had requested. But there was no turning the clock back. Her biggest worry was whether Mrs. Chapman suspected something had happened between Henry and her. She had made several waspish criticisms about Molly's work over recent days, to the point where it felt as though she could do nothing right. Once the picnic was made and the family had gone out, Hester poured herself and Molly a glass of lemonade each. "Let's sit outside in the garden for a little while. We've been rushed off our feet all day, and they won't be back for hours." They sat on the bench under the shade of an apple tree in the kitchen garden. It was a glorious sunny day, but Molly scarcely noticed. She picked at the corner of her apron and sighed. "I'm wondering whether I should look for a new family to work for," she said eventually. "I think Mrs. Chapman suspects something about what Henry did. It's making it almost impossible for me to stay." "That doesn't seem very fair," Hester said. She shot her friend a sympathetic smile. "Why is it the wealthy folks can do what they like, and it's us who suffer the consequences? That's just the way it is for us, I suppose." Molly drank some lemonade and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to imagine what it would be like to start over in service to a different family. "Do you think Mrs. Chapman would even give me a reference?" She realized suddenly what a precarious position Henry had placed her in. Without a good reference, the chances of working for a nice family in the local area were slim. They would wonder what she had done wrong if she didn't get Mrs. Chapman's seal of approval. "Maybe it's time for both of us to look for something new," Hester said casually. She grinned at Molly, seeing her eyes widen with surprise. "You're settled here. Why would you change if you don't need to? Mrs. Chapman never finds fault with your work, Hester. Besides, what if you end up too far away to see Freddie?" Hester put her glass down and folded her arms. "Freddie isn't the man for me," she said firmly. "He wasn't as kind as I thought he was. It turns out he was supposed to be engaged to a young woman who lives near the docks, and he was only paying me some attention to make her jealous." Molly pulled a face. "We're both destined to be spinsters at this rate." "Aha, that's where you're wrong." Hester's eyes twinkled with excitement as she jumped up and ran into the kitchen, returning a moment later with a newspaper in her hand. "I've decided I'm ready for a more adventurous life than being a maid for the Chapman family until I'm old and gray. Look, this is the matrimonial times, and this is where our future lies." Molly glanced across at the paper, feeling intrigued. "You're thinking of marrying a man you've never even met before? Surely you'd miss your family too much?" Hester spread the newspaper out on the table and jabbed her finger at an advertisement at the top of the page. "My ma and pa came all the way to Boston from Germany. These gentlemen only live on the other side of the country. When I mentioned it to Ma, she didn't seem too upset. She's got her hands full looking after my younger brothers and sisters anyway. Look, this is the one I'm going to reply to. Mr. John Carson. He has a ranch just outside the town of Griffin Creek in Oregon, and he's looking for a hard-working woman to be his bride." Molly leaned over and read the advertisement Hester was pointing to. Mr. Carson sounded like a good catch. He was only 26, and he was offering a comfortable homestead and life on a busy ranch to whichever lady he felt an affinity to after a period of corresponding via letter to make sure they were right for each other. She felt a sudden wave of sadness at the thought of losing her best friend. "Have you replied to his advertisement yet? I'll miss you so much, Hester. Do you really think this is the right thing to do?" She wanted to be happy for Hester, but it was hard when she couldn't shake the feeling she was being left behind. "Well, yes, but I haven't posted it yet," Hester said with a chuckle. "I'm showing you this because I think you should reply to some advertisements as well. Think about it, Molly. This is our chance for an exciting new adventure, a fresh start in life. Her enthusiasm was infectious, which was why Molly didn't dismiss the idea immediately. Me? What about my job? I can't just up and leave. Why not? Henry has toyed with your affections, and you said yourself that you don't think you can stay here much longer. Instead of looking for a new job, why don't you get married? We don't want to end up being spinsters, do we? You make it sound so simple. Molly felt a ripple of optimism. Hester was right. There was nothing keeping her in Boston other than her job with the Chapmans. But that might be in jeopardy thanks to Henry's actions, and she had no family to stay here for. It just so happens that there are 2 other gentlemen from Griffin Creek looking for a mail-order bride. They both sound perfect, Molly. Just think, we could travel out together. It's like it was meant to be. Hester folded the paper and passed it to Molly. Why don't you have a look? I've already written my reply, and you could write yours this evening. What have we got to lose? All right, Molly replied with a nervous giggle. But if I don't like the look of those gentlemen, or if I think they wouldn't be interested in me, I'm not doing it on a whim just to keep you happy. She hurried back into the kitchen, thinking that Hester was far braver than her. She would look at the advertisements, but didn't hold out any hope that there would be one that would stand out to her as worth answering. Besides, Henry would probably announce his engagement to Amelia soon, she told herself. Mrs. Chapman would be happy. Hester would forget about this harebrained idea, and hopefully, life could go back to normal. A few hours later, the rumble of carriage wheels outside the house told Molly that Henry and his mother had returned. She quickly laid a tea tray and cut some cake for Mrs. Chapman to have in her parlor, as was her habit. Put it over there. I have a terrible headache. Miriam Chapman was reclining on her chaise longue when Molly took the tray through for her and waved her arm weakly toward the low table nearby. Yes, ma'am. Would you like me to fetch you a cold drink as well? Or shall I prepare your bedroom if you'd rather rest upstairs? It's not the heat causing my headache, it's Henry. Mrs. Chapman sat up suddenly and gave Molly a suspicious look. The silly boy has got it into his head that he doesn't want to marry Amelia Defoe, and I'm sure her mother will blame it all on me. I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. Molly's hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea, and it splashed into the saucer. She hastily mopped it up. Henry has told me he's in love with someone else, but he wouldn't say who it is. Would you happen to know anything about who's caught his eye, Molly? I know he confides in you, even though it's most inappropriate. Molly felt her cheeks flush. Should she confess that it was her? She dismissed the thought as soon as it came into her mind. No, ma'am, I can't say I do. Amelia is perfect for him if only he could see it. Anyway, I've taken matters into my own hands. Mr. Chapman and I are taking Henry away for a few weeks under the guise of it being a business trip for the mill. And I happen to know that Mrs. Defoe and Amelia will be staying at the same hotel. Once they spend some more time together, safely away from Boston, and this ridiculous romantic dalliance Henry fancies himself embroiled in, he'll soon see that Amelia should become his wife instead. She brightened at the thought of her plan and took a large bite of poppy seed cake. When are you leaving, ma'am? Mrs. Chapman reached for her cup of tea, looking better already. First thing tomorrow morning, so I'd like you and Hester to start packing our things immediately. She took a sip of her tea, watching Molly like a hawk. I'd thank you not to share what I just said with anyone. I'm sure you only want the best for Henry. It's high time he put this childish friendship with you behind him, so I'll expect you to behave more like a maid. Once he's married to Amelia, you'll probably want to start looking for another position, Molly. We won't need you as well as Hester, so consider this your last few months at Wyndham Street. Molly gulped and bobbed her head, not knowing whether to feel hurt or relieved that the decision had been taken for her. Thank you, ma'am. You've been very kind in giving me work since I left the orphanage. Quite. I have more than discharged my duties to help the needy. Mrs. Chapman relaxed back onto the cushions, happy that Molly didn't seem too upset. I'm glad we've reached an understanding, and I'm sure I shall be able to provide some sort of reference as long as you continue to carry out your duties. I don't want you becoming idle just because you're leaving us soon. Chapter 4. Roxbury, Boston. Molly glanced around the room she had shared with Hester for the last 2 years. It was tucked away in the eaves of the house and generously proportioned for a maid's bedroom. She could hardly imagine living anywhere else when she had been at Wyndham Street for so long, but now that Mrs. Chapman had given her notice to leave, she knew she had no choice but to get used to the idea. It must be fate, Hester had declared when Molly had told her that Mrs. Chapman had mentioned she should start looking for work elsewhere. The fact that you have a few months left here is perfect. It means you'll have time to start corresponding with one of the gentlemen in the advertisements. She had taken over washing the dishes and sent Molly upstairs, saying they had no time to lose. Taking a deep breath, Molly flicked open the newspaper. She had heard of other women traveling west to marry, and always assumed they must be desperate, or worse, running away from a bad situation. Exactly like me. She shook her head with a sigh. She should have known that nothing lasted forever. An orphan with no family like her had limited prospects. She felt humbled, realizing that she had been wrong to judge those women for looking for marriage in this way. But then she thought of Hester. Her friend wasn't downtrodden or running away. She was just looking for adventure. Clearly, there was a myriad of reasons why a woman might end up being a mail-order bride, and this gave her comfort. It didn't mean she was a failure. In fact, if Hester were to be believed, it would be an exciting new chapter that would allow her to put Henry's careless actions behind her once and for all. She pulled the lamp closer and started reading through the advertisements. There were several pages of them, but they seemed to have a common thread running through them. These gentlemen were hard-working and too busy to look for a bride the traditional way. Several of the matrimonial agencies had also written that there was a lack of suitable single women in the western frontier towns for the gentlemen who were using their services. It all sounded much more legitimate than she had first imagined, and she felt her spirits rise. Bearing Hester's comments in mind, she scanned the pages, looking for any other men in Griffin Creek. It would be a great comfort to be in the same town as Hester if they could somehow both end up there together instead of being completely alone. There were 2 advertisements that fitted the bill, and Molly read them both aloud several times, trying to get a sense of the person behind each one. Mr. Webb, age 27. I am a gentleman of private means, and I have my own boarding house in Griffin Creek. I am seeking a kind-hearted, hard-working wife with whom I can have a family. In return, I can provide a comfortable home, a secure income, and a future with a loving husband. Molly nodded in approval and marked the paper with her pen next to Mr. Webb's advertisement. Her years working as a maid would surely be ideal for helping to run a boarding house, she thought with a smile. Mr. Trott is a recently widowed gentleman whose work for a lumber company means he needs a wife to help care for his 2 young children. The successful applicant will have an independent spirit and, in return, a home at the edge of Griffin Creek and the chance for a new life in a thriving frontier town. The more Molly read the advertisements, the more she felt drawn to the one written by Mr. Webb. For starters, he had taken the time to write the advertisement himself, which she felt showed that he was more personable. Also, the fact that he wanted to start a family with his new bride was exactly what she had longed for ever since she'd left the orphanage. By comparison, Mr. Trott's advertisement sounded almost like a business transaction, and she wondered why he didn't just employ a housekeeper. She quickly penned a reply to Mr. Webb, folded it up, and slid it into an envelope before she lost her courage. Just as she was tucking the letter into her apron pocket, Hester came running up the stairs. Have you replied? She hopped impatiently from one foot to the other. Yes, but only to one of them, Molly said quickly. I know you said I should write to both gentlemen, but I don't want to end up being a glorified housekeeper, which is what Mr. Trott's advertisement felt like. I may as well stay in Boston if I were to do that. Mr. Webb is the only one who speaks about being a loving husband, so that's who I'm replying to. Hester clapped her hands. Wonderful. I've written my letter to Mr. Carson, too. I'll be able to send them both tomorrow when I go into town to fetch Mrs. Chapman's new summer shawl from the dressmaker. She told me she wants it first thing in the morning so she can take it on the business trip Mr. Chapman is taking them all on. Molly and Hester were left with a long list of extra chores to get on with while the Chapmans were away. Mrs. Chapman had decided it was an excellent opportunity for them to spring clean the whole house from top to bottom, so Molly scarcely had time to think about the letter. With help from the gardener, they dragged the furniture from each room in turn and then scrubbed, mopped, and polished until everything gleamed and the whole house smelt of beeswax and lavender. In between times, they stoked up the fire and boiled all of the sheets, taking advantage of the fine, dry weather to get the laundry washed and dried in no time. I could sleep for a week. Molly eased her boots off and wiggled her toes. Mind you, there's something very satisfying about being able to get on with things without constantly being interrupted to fetch something for Mrs. Chapman. Hester turned her face to the sun and closed her eyes, returning to her favorite topic of conversation. "Do you think you'll receive a reply today? I had mine a couple of days ago from Mr. Carson." She fidgeted and opened her eyes again. They were taking a 10-minute break in the garden, and she perked up as she heard a shout from the gateway. It was the gardener, and he had a letter in his hand. "This came. It's for you, Molly." Hester jumped up and ran over to grab it, waving it triumphantly. "You see, I knew Mr. Webb would write back." She thrust it at Molly and perched on the edge of her chair, eagerly waiting to see what it said. Molly opened the envelope, and her heart started to thud under her dress. "It won't come to anything, I'm sure. I mean, it's probably best for me to stay in Boston, don't you think?" "Don't keep me in suspense." Hester sounded exasperated. "Just read it, will you? He'd be a fool to turn you down, Molly." "Dear Miss Larkin," Molly began. She swallowed nervously, not wanting to read on. "Here, let me read it out for you," Hester said with a chuckle. "You're assuming the worst when it could be good news." She cleared her throat and read the letter out. "Dear Miss Larkin, thank you for your letter replying to my advertisement. I enjoyed reading a little about your life in Boston and the family you work for. As you rightly say, being a maid would stand you in good stead for helping me in my boarding house. I work long hours, but I don't want you to think that I'm only looking for help with the business. I'm seeking a wife to build a life with and have children with, which you said you want as well. Like you, I don't have any other family left. My parents passed when I was nearly 20, and my brother not long afterward. Although it's sad and your situation is somewhat different, being that you were orphaned young, I think it's a good omen that we have this in common. I have received quite a few replies to my advertisement, but I feel most drawn to yours. Therefore, I would like to correspond with only you, Miss Larkin. I hope you take that as a sign of my integrity. I look forward to receiving your next letter and getting to know you better in the coming months. Yours sincerely, Owen Webb." Hester's eyes shone as she finished reading the letter out to Molly. "He sounds wonderful, don't you think?" Molly nodded, blinking back sudden tears. "I kept telling myself not to expect a reply or that he might say he wasn't interested. But you're right, Hester. He does sound like the sort of gentleman who I could grow to love." "I can't believe how lucky we've both been," Hester replied with a happy sigh. "Out of all the advertisements in the newspaper, we're writing to two kind, upstanding men from the same town. It's perfect, Molly. We'll be able to travel west together. We might even have children at the same time, and our families will be great friends." Molly couldn't help but feel excited by the future Hester was describing for them both. Suddenly, all her worries about Henry's kiss and losing everything she knew in Boston no longer seemed insurmountable. "Thank you for encouraging me, Hester," she said, throwing her arms around her friend. "What would I have done without you all these years? I might not have had a family of my own, but you're the best sort of friend I could have ever wished for. Now we just have to see what happens with these gentlemen of ours out west. Who knows? Even if Mr. Webb doesn't propose, maybe I could look for work in Griffin Creek anyway. It's time for an adventure, like you said." Chapter 5. Roxbury, Boston. As late spring gave way to the long, hot days of summer, Molly found herself looking forward to writing to Owen more and more. Somehow she felt more comfortable sharing snippets of her life when it was by correspondence. She had never considered herself to be a naturally confident person, unlike Hester's bubbly personality, so the fact that Owen was getting to know her gradually this way suited her. She signed off her latest letter with a flourish and tucked it into her apron pocket. Cook had asked her to go to the butcher to fetch an extra joint of ham so she would be able to post her letter at the same time. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" Henry's voice drifted out from his father's study. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway. "Are we still friends, Molly? I feel as though I've done something you don't approve of." He gave her a boyish smile and fell into step next to her as she continued toward the kitchen. Cook was outside telling the gardener what fruit she wanted, so they were alone, which seemed to please him. "Of course we're friends, but we have our separate lives to lead now. We're not children anymore." Molly smiled to show she meant her words kindly. Henry pulled a face, looking sorry for himself. "You're cross because I've been spending so much time with Amelia, aren't you? It's Mama's fault. She wants us to get married, and I feel as though I have no choice in the matter." He brushed his hand on Molly's shoulder. "I'd rather be with you, but you know how determined Mama can be when she gets an idea into her head." He suddenly brightened and gave her a flirtatious grin. "I enjoyed our kiss." Molly stepped back out of his reach. "Henry, you must stop this now. It's not fair. I might be just a maid, but I have a reputation to keep as well." She lifted her chin and gave him a defiant look. "It won't harm. Besides, nobody would need to know. I'm not ready to settle down with Amelia yet. Not when I still have feelings for you." "No, Henry." Molly picked up her shawl and tied it around her shoulders. "I need to tell you that I probably won't be at Wyndham Street for much longer. Your ma has suggested I move on as she doesn't need me here, especially once you and Amelia get married." "But I haven't even proposed yet." Henry muttered sulkily. He frowned, not liking the way she had rebuffed him. "In that case, you shouldn't leave it much longer," Molly said firmly. "You know she's a nice young lady who will make you the perfect wife. I think we've both made the error of mistaking friendship for something more, don't you?" Her gaze softened, and she smiled at Henry until he gave her a reluctant nod and smiled back. "Oh, all right. You're correct, as per usual," he said with a wry chuckle. "I'm sorry. I have been thoughtless, and you deserve better than that. I got carried away and let my emotions take over me. I am very fond of Amelia, and it's a good social match. I'm going to announce my engagement later this week, but that's our secret for now, all right?" He handed Molly her basket. "I've been a bit of a fool. Are we friends again?" "We never stopped being friends, silly." Molly gave him a stern look before grinning again. "You're a good fellow, Henry, and I've learned a lot from you since I came here from the orphanage, what with reading all those books to you when you were unwell. I wish you and Amelia a very happy marriage." "And you too, whenever that day comes," Henry quipped. "Hester mentioned that you've caught someone's eye. He'll be a lucky fellow to call you his wife, whoever he is, and I hope he treats you well, or he'll have me to answer to." Molly blushed. "It's early days, and we're not really courting as such." A few minutes later, as she hurried through the streets to carry out her chores, she felt a surge of relief that she and Henry had cleared the air. Even though she knew she didn't owe Henry an explanation, she hadn't wanted to leave her position at the Chapmans without telling him, not after 10 years of friendship. And now he had given her his blessing, in a brotherly sort of way, which made it easier for her to consider a future far away from Boston. This time, when she posted her letter to Griffin Creek, she felt a shiver of anticipation at what might lie ahead. She and Owen had been writing to each other for over 3 months. Hester had been getting more excited as each week went by after one of her ma's acquaintances had assured her that other ladies usually received a proposal within 4 or 5 months. "We could be getting engaged any day," Hester had said dreamily the night before as she brushed her hair. "Mrs. Carson and Mrs. Webb. Imagine that, Molly. Henry isn't the only one with new beginnings on the horizon. What do you think Mrs. Chapman will say if we both leave at the same time?" Molly had hugged her knees, sitting up in bed. "What does it matter?" Hester had replied airily. "We'll be heading west to get married, so it's not as if we'll even need a reference. I'll be working on John's ranch, and you'll be helping Owen in his boarding house. We'll never need to be beholden to an employer again." As Molly thought back to the conversation from the night before, she hoped Hester was right. Hester's resignation would come as a surprise to Mrs. Chapman, but regardless, Molly knew she would need to make plans to either travel west or look for work very soon. Mrs. Chapman would no doubt want Henry and Amelia to get married as quickly as possible, so her days at Wyndham Street would be coming to an end before long. The next few weeks flew by in a flurry of excitement. True to his word, Henry had gotten engaged to Amelia a couple of days after his conversation with Molly, and the household had been abuzz with wedding preparations ever since. Mrs. Chapman appeared in the kitchen almost daily with a list of extra tasks for Molly and Hester. Amelia's father had offered the happy couple a house to live in, and there was already a sense of Wyndham Street becoming part of Molly's past as they packed up Henry's belongings, ready for him to move out. The place won't be the same without him. Mrs. Mallory surveyed the groaning shelves of her pickles and preserves in the pantry. She consulted her list and then started carrying a selection of the jars to a large basket on the kitchen table. Master Henry is very particular about what he likes to eat. I'm going to have to make sure he takes plenty of food with him. Goodness knows what sort of a cook Amelia's ma has employed for them. Hester winked at Molly. Maybe she's gotten someone from Paris, cook? I hear the Defoes are well-traveled. Paris? Saints preserve me. What would she want to do that for? What Henry needs is good plain cooking, like I've always given him. Hester's just teasing you, Molly said hastily, seeing Cook's eyes starting to fill with tears. Besides, they're not going far. I'm sure they'll be back dining here plenty of times, and you know Henry says your food is the best he's ever eaten. Bless you, Molly. For a moment there, I was starting to think I should offer to give their cook some training so Henry gets the food he enjoys. Mrs. Mallory glared at Hester. It's a good thing I'm not easily offended, young lady. Now, make us some coffee. There are fresh coffee beans on the dresser that the delivery boy brought yesterday. Hester had the grace to look apologetic. Sit down and rest for a minute, Mrs. Mallory. We're all going to miss Henry, that's for sure. She hurried to the dresser for the coffee beans and suddenly noticed 2 letters tucked behind the brown paper parcel the beans were wrapped up in. Pulling them out, she gave a little skip of excitement. Look, Molly, we've had more letters. Oh yes, the boy did mention he'd bumped into the postman, but I got called away and told him to leave everything on the table. It completely slipped my mind. Hester sat down and quickly opened her letter. Her cheeks flushed pink as she read the contents. John has proposed, she squealed. She clasped the letter to her chest and her eyes filled with tears of happiness. He says he wants me to travel west as soon as possible so that there's no chance of getting delayed by bad weather. Jumping up again, she twirled around the kitchen, laughing and crying at the same time. I'm getting married, Mrs. Mallory. Can you believe it? Molly hugged Hester, laughing with her. Congratulations, I'm so happy for you. But what about your letter, Molly? Open it quickly. Molly blushed. Owen is a little more reserved than John, Hester. You know that. I expect he wants longer to think about committing himself. We're still just happy exchanging news at the moment, not declarations of love. Hester's face fell. I so hoped that we might travel west together. What does he say? Once the coffee had been poured, while Hester excitedly told Mrs. Mallory how romantic her fiancé was, Molly opened her letter with shaking hands and quickly read it. Dear Molly, I feel we've corresponded for long enough now for me to get a feel for the kind of person you are. I'm not one for fancy words or grand gestures, but I'd like to offer you my hand in marriage, and I'm sure we'll be very happy together. Things are getting busy with the business, so I've enclosed money for your railroad fare and to cover other expenses. It would be my dearest wish for you to join me here in Griffin Creek at the earliest chance. I believe there's a train running every week, which means you could be here in no time. I look forward to being your loyal and loving husband. Yours sincerely, Owen Webb. Molly felt the breath catch in her throat as she hastily read the letter again. She could hardly believe that he had proposed. He hadn't seemed like the type to rush into anything. But there it was in writing. He wanted to marry her, and as soon as possible. Guess what, Hester? We'll be traveling west together after all. Molly felt as though her heart was going to burst with happiness. Owen has proposed, and he wants me to book a railroad ticket on the next train out. Chapter 6. 6. After stowing her carpet bag in the luggage rack, Molly sank gratefully into the corner seat of their carriage. Although Owen had only given her enough money for a hard wooden bench seat in third class, John had been more generous with Hester, so she had insisted on giving Molly a few coins so they could be in the more comfortable carriage together. I can't believe it's really happening, Molly. After all those months of exchanging letters, we're on our way. Hester's eyes were still red from all the tears she had shed as her large family had waved them off at the station. She blew her nose one final time, and a few moments later, her usual good humor was restored. Here, have one of the mint humbugs cook-packed for us. Molly passed the twist of candy over, and then offered it to the two other women who were sitting with them. Hester kept up a cheerful stream of conversation for the first hour of their journey, reliving the last few days. Mrs. Chapman had been disappointed that they were both leaving at the same time and shocked that they were going so far away. Cook had channeled her sadness at losing her friends into baking fruit cakes and cookies for them to take on the journey. Hester had told her there would be food in the dining carriage, but Mrs. Mallory didn't trust there would be enough and insisted on giving them a basket full of food to take with them. As for Henry, he had come up the servants' stairs the night before to seek Molly out. "Are you sure you're doing the right thing?" His gray eyes were clouded with worry. "I know it's none of my business who you marry, Molly, but you haven't even met this fellow. What if he's not the person he's portrayed himself to be in these letters? It seems a risky business, if you ask me." Molly had been touched by his concern. "We've been writing for months, Henry, and Hester tells me that lots of women do it. There are pages of advertisements in the Matrimonial Times. He seems like a kind and genuine man, and this is a chance for me to help him with his business, our business, instead of only being in service." Henry had swept her into a brotherly hug before stepping back and pulling something from his pocket. "I want you to have these. If you ever get into trouble and need money, you can pawn them or sell them. I'd hate to think of you being stuck in a bad situation you couldn't get out of." He had pressed a pair of his silver cufflinks and a silver-backed hairbrush into her hand, much to her surprise. "I can't take these. It wouldn't be right," Molly had hastily replied, trying to give them back. "I insist, and if everything goes well and you never need to sell them, they could be a gift for your children one day. It's the least I can do, and it will make me feel better about you being so far away." A sudden judder in the carriage, as they hit a rough patch on the rails, snapped her back to the present, and she blinked back the tears that pricked the back of her eyes. She must look forward, she told herself. As fond as her memories of Henry were, they were part of her past now, and she had a new life just about to begin. The next week passed in an exhausting blur of too little sleep and long days spent watching the countryside beyond the window as the wheels of the train clattered incessantly on the railroad tracks. The view changed from rolling hills, wide, dusty plains, and occasional towns where they would stop for a few hours to stretch their legs as new supplies were brought onto the train. The one thing that remained constant, though, was the thrum of emotions that Molly found herself experiencing. 1 minute full of anticipation, and the next battling worries that she was taking a huge leap into the unknown. Hester pored over all the letters that John had written her, reading excerpts of them excitedly, and Molly couldn't help but reflect how much more romantic John sounded compared to Owen. Owen's letters had started off full of affection and sharing his hopes for the future, but the last few had been perfunctory, as though he had become distracted by other things. He has a busy boarding house to run. And not everyone likes to share their romantic feelings as readily as John and Hester seemed to. Molly reassured herself with all the rational reasons as to why Owen's emotions had seemed to cool, reminding herself that he had been under no obligation to propose marriage. The fact that he had must mean he wanted her as his wife. She just had to stay calm and remember that it was normal to feel a little nervous about her forthcoming wedding. She closed her eyes and tried to picture him in her mind. He had told her he was 28 and tall, with dark hair and brown eyes. Her mouth curved into a smile as she drifted off into a fitful sleep, dreaming of the children they would have and how cozy she would make their home. The conductor said we're nearly at Griffin Creek. Hester's voice pulled Molly from her slumbers, and her eyes snapped open as a surge of excitement fizzed in her stomach. Beyond the window, Molly could see that Hester was right. In the time she had been asleep, they had left the flat plains behind, and now she could see lakes and mountains in the distance. Nestled in the low foothills, Griffin Creek looked like a typical sprawling frontier town, a mixture of ranches, wooden and brick buildings, and wide, dusty streets that spread haphazardly in every direction, showing how the town had developed rapidly over recent years. It looks to be a much bigger town than I imagined. One of the other ladies leaned forward to peer out of the window. I'm sure you and Owen will have a thriving business, Hester remarked, grinning at Molly. Just think how many people must come and visit. You'll be far wealthier than if we'd stayed back in our dull old lives. Didn't I tell you this would be the making of us? She patted her curls and pinched her cheeks to bring some color to them. And just look at all those ranches we've passed. They look so huge with grand homesteads. Molly's eyes sparkled as the brakes started to squeal on the train. We'll have to meet up in a few weeks. It's going to be so much fun, Hester. I hope John and Owen get on well together. Maybe they already know each other? At long last, the train juddered to a halt at the station. Taking the conductor's hand, Molly stepped down, and a light breeze lifted her curls. Compared to the air of Boston, here it felt crisp and fresh, and Molly took a deep breath, glad to have finally arrived. Although it was a small station, there was a throng of people milling around, and she and Hester stuck close together as the porters unloaded all the luggage and shouted instructions to those waiting to board. I can see him, Hester squeaked. That must be John. He said he was tall with blonde hair. Molly watched as a ruggedly handsome man strode toward them. He swept his hat off, and his eyes twinkled as a wide grin split his face. Miss Jones? Hester, I can't believe you're finally here. Oh, John, me either. Hester giggled and blushed at the same time. I've been waiting for almost an hour. I was so worried about being late to pick you up. John took Hester's hand in his own, looking slightly bashful. Everyone at the ranch is so excited to meet you. We've gotten the guest rooms ready for you, and my housekeeper has told the pastor we can be wed next week, if that's to your liking. That sounds perfect, Hester said with a happy sigh. Let's get going then. It's about half an hour out of town, and I'm sure you must be exhausted from all the traveling. I'm so grateful you said yes, Hester. You're just so beautiful. John proffered his arm, ready to take Hester to his wagon, but she hesitated, turning back to Molly. Should we wait for Owen to arrive? Hester glanced between Molly and John. This is my very dear friend, Molly. Remember I told you she was traveling out with me, John. Molly bobbed a greeting as John shook hands with her warmly. You must come and visit us at the ranch. Any friend of Hester's is a friend of mine too. Who is coming to meet you here today? He looked up and down the platform, but the crowds had cleared, and there didn't seem to be anyone else arriving from the main street where the horses and wagons were tied up. I'm engaged to Mr. Owen Webb, Molly said quickly. She pushed down the small pang of envy at John's effusive welcome for Hester. He's always very busy with his boarding house. I'm sure he'll be here any minute. John nodded, looking doubtful. There's only one train a day. I'm sure he didn't mean to leave you standing here alone. Like you said, he must have gotten busy with something. Maybe an emergency came up. Molly hugged Hester and shooed her away. Don't wait on my account. You still have further to go. Remember, I'll be at the Cedars boarding house. Promise you'll come and visit just as soon as you've settled in. You're marrying Owen Webb, you say? John looked puzzled for a moment, but before he could say any more, one of the porters barged between them with a handcart stacked high with boxes and trunks. Yes. Do you know him? Molly wondered why John's expression looked suddenly guarded. Not really. He drinks at the saloon next to the mercantile store sometimes. Everyone knows everyone by sight around here, pretty much. John tipped his hat to her and placed it back on his head. Shall I take you home now, Hester? There's a nice hot bath and a hearty meal awaiting you so you can get over the journey. Hester gave Molly one last hug. "Do you mind?" she whispered. "I'll wait if you want me to." "No, you two get along home. Let's go out for tea and cake soon, and then we can share all our news." Molly tried to push her worries aside as she watched Hester and John leave the station. They were arm in arm, deep in an animated conversation already, and she couldn't shake off the feeling that Owen's late arrival was a bad omen. With a heavy sigh, she looked for somewhere out of the shade she could wait, settling on the bench near the entrance. The station clock ticked on, half an hour, and then an hour passed with nobody new arriving. What if Henry was right, and Owen isn't even who he says he is? How will I survive? Molly's thoughts skittered through her mind, conjuring up a worse scenario with each passing moment. She took a deep breath. Grateful that Henry had insisted, she took his parting gifts as a small comfort of financial security should she need it. Dear Lord, please calm my fears and give me the strength to deal with whatever may happen here in Griffin Creek. She closed her eyes for a moment, wondering if she had enough money to pay for a few nights in a cheap boarding house while she looked for work. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. "Molly, it must be you, seeing as you're the only person here." She looked up with a start. The deep voice had a rough edge to it, as though irritated by something. Standing up hastily, she took a closer look at the man standing in front of her. His unkempt hair was mousy brown, and his eyes were bloodshot. Although he had the faint trace of a man who had been good-looking once upon a time, the barrel chest had turned to a paunch, and his rugged features were blurred by too many years of drink and hard living. Yes, I'm Molly Larkin. You must be Owen? Pleased to make your acquaintance." Molly held her hand out to shake hands, remembering Cook's sage words of advice that good looks didn't necessarily equate to gentlemanly manners. She smiled up at him, waiting for some sort of sign that he was pleased to see her. "We'd best get going," Owen muttered, ignoring her proffered hand. His gaze raked up and down her body, making the blood rush to her cheeks as his unexpectedly blatant stare lingered on her curves. "I was thinking you might have been overgenerous describing yourself, but you're pretty enough." He broke into a leering smile and leaned closer to grab her carpetbag. Molly gritted her teeth, fighting the urge to step backward as a fug of stale whiskey fumes enveloped her. She wondered whether he was late because he'd been drinking or whether it was from the previous night. Either way, the contrast between his lackluster welcome and the way John had been with Hester was a shock. She swallowed the lump in her throat and tried again. "Thank you for the compliment. I'm very pleased to be here, Owen, and looking forward to seeing the Cedars. It sounds lovely from your letters." Owen nodded with a non-committal grunt. "In case you're wondering why I'm a few minutes late, it's because I've been chasing down Pastor Fletcher. I'm so busy with work, I thought it best to get on with the wedding right away. It turns out he's gone over the mountains to minister to the sick." "Oh, should I stay somewhere else for a little while? I've come west with a good friend. I'm sure she would be happy for me to stay at their ranch until the pastor returns." "No need. I've found someone else who has agreed to take care of the ceremony out of town. Pastor Luke. It should all be over in a couple of hours." Owen took hold of her elbow and steered her out of the station to his awaiting wagon, throwing her bag carelessly in the back before handing her up onto the splintered seat. Folding her hands on her lap to stop them from trembling, Molly blinked rapidly, fighting back her tears. This was not the welcome she had imagined at all. She had been looking forward to a few days getting accustomed to Griffin Creek and Owen. She had even wondered whether Hester and John would have celebrated with them at their wedding. Instead, Owen seemed to consider the whole thing a formality to be rushed through. "It's because he's so busy," she told herself again. Risking a sideways glance at him, Molly shivered as he turned his gaze on her again, looking at her without any hint of affection. "I've made a terrible mistake, and there's nothing I can do about it." The shocking thought almost made Molly gasp out loud. She looked away, gripping the side of the wagon as it lurched forward, taking her toward a wedding she was no longer sure she even wanted to be part of. Chapter 7. Griffin Creek, Oregon. In spite of her doubts, as Owen's horse trotted along, pulling the wagon through Griffin Creek, Molly could see it was a pleasant town. Many of the houses had picket fences and generous gardens that looked well tended. Her spirits began to lift, and she wondered whether she had been too hasty in her assessment of him. Maybe he's nervous, she told herself. After all, she had been nervous, so it stood to reason he might be as well. She was sure that once they had gotten used to their new routine after the wedding, things would get better. After about half an hour, Owen turned the horse up a narrow track, cracking the whip to make him trot faster. "Hope you're looking forward to married life?" he asked with a chuckle. "People tell me I'm a good catch, so you're lucky I picked you." Molly nodded, lost for words. There was something about the direct way he spoke that left her tongue-tied. Even the uneducated tradesmen who called at Wyndham Street had never spoken in such a manner, and if they had, Cook would have chased them down the path, brandishing her wooden spoon for being so rude. "Here we are, then." Owen jerked his head toward a small wooden building that looked more like a storage shed than a house of God. "It's a local meeting room, which the pastor said is good enough. It ain't fancy, but that doesn't matter, does it? The pastor can't stay long, so we'd better be quick." Molly adjusted her bonnet and tightened her shawl over her shoulders. The sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains, and it was cool in the shade. Once she was standing on the ground, she shook the creases and dust out of her skirts. She felt grimy and tired from the journey, but there was no point wishing she'd had time to wash and change. "Will there be anyone else here?" She arranged her face into a smile, taking a deep breath at the thought of making a commitment to Owen in the eyes of the Lord. "Nope, just us. That's how I like it," Owen replied. "You look pretty enough. Let's get inside." He clamped her hand in the crook of his arm and flung open the door. It creaked ominously, sagging on its hinges, but he was unperturbed and swept her inside. "Oh, it's rather plain." The words popped out of Molly's mouth before she could stop them. The inside of the building was even more dilapidated than the outside. A few worm-riddled chairs and a table remained, but the rest had been removed long ago, and the floor was littered with dried leaves and dirt. "Well, sorry, ma'am, but this is how we do things out west," Owen replied sarcastically. "You'd better get used to it, too. We ain't full of airs and graces." He hurried her to the end of the room, where a man in a black jacket was sitting, with his feet up on another chair and his hat over his face, seemingly asleep. "Get up, you lazy fella." Owen kicked the chair, and the man's feet crashed to the floor, sending up a cloud of dust. "Huh? Oh, it's you." The man yawned and put his hat on the back of his head as he stood up. He shot Molly a curious look and then gave Owen a sly smile. "I see the Lord has blessed you with a purty one this "Quit your yapping," Owen growled, interrupting him. "I thought you were in a hurry?" He put his hand in his pocket and pulled out several coins, slapping them on the table next to him. "Are you going to marry us or what?" Pastor Luke nodded and pocketed the coins quickly before pulling a Bible from inside his coat. All right. Remember, I'm doing you a favor, Mr. Webb. You would have been waiting weeks for the usual pastor." "Maybe. Do you think we should wait for the other pastor after all?" Molly whispered, tugging on Owen's sleeve. She turned Owen toward her slightly. "This fellow seems a little unusual," she added, raising her eyebrows. The smell of stale liquor wafting from Pastor Luke was hard to ignore, and he seemed unsteady on his feet. Owen grinned. "Like I said, we do things differently out west." He turned them both back to face the pastor. The next few minutes felt almost like a dream to Molly. Pastor Luke fumbled through the brief ceremony, muttering that he was out of practice with a scowl when Owen cussed him for being a fool. It was as though he had never married anyone before, as he scratched the stubble on his chin, trying to find the correct pages in his dog-eared Bible. "There you are, Mr. Webb. I pronounce you man and wife," the pastor finally announced with a sigh of relief, before scurrying away without so much as a backward glance. Molly was startled to realize that she was now a married woman. It had all happened so unceremoniously fast that she could scarcely believe it. By the time they got back to Griffin Creek, it was almost dark, and Molly felt so exhausted she could hardly keep her eyes open. The wagon rattled slowly through the streets until Owen stopped in front of a large clapboard house. A sign at the front with peeling paint announced it to be the Cedars boarding house. and she thought longingly of getting a good night's sleep between freshly laundered sheets. "Welcome to your new home, Mrs. Webb." Owen clicked his tongue and continued around the corner to the back of the building, where he jumped down and hitched the horse. Molly was surprised to see the downstairs rooms were all lit up, as though there was some sort of party taking place. "Do you have many guests staying at the moment?" She took hold of Owen's hand as he helped her down. "I didn't even get around to asking how many rooms you have." Owen shook his head. "None at the moment. I'm in the process of changing the business. There are too many other boarding houses in town, so I serve a different sort of customer instead, much more lucrative." Molly followed him up the path, and the sudden sound of breaking glass and shouting from inside the building made her jump. "What's happening, Owen? It sounds like a fight." "Think nothing of it," he said blithely. "It's probably just someone cheating at cards. I'll sort them out in no time." Owen threw the door open and gestured for her to go inside. "Make sure you have a good night's sleep. You'll have a busy day tomorrow. You'll see which room is yours. It's at the top of the house." With that, he strode off toward the direction of where the noise had come from, and the sound of raucous laughter and drunken men talking loudly soon resumed again, much to Molly's dismay. Molly trudged up the stairs with her carpet bag, following his directions. The light from her lamp revealed that the place had definitely seen better days, and she decided that her first task would be to give the place a good clean from top to bottom. She wasn't afraid of hard work. It would be just like spring cleaning at the Chapman's house, except without Hester's company to keep her entertained. When she reached the top floor, she pushed the bedroom door open tentatively, wincing as the hinges squeaked. She held the lamp up higher, thinking back to John telling Hester about the comfortable bed his housekeeper had prepared for her to rest after the journey. She had hoped Owen might have done the same, but the weak light from her lamp dashed her hopes instantly. The bedroom looked as though it hadn't been used for a while. Cobwebs hung down from the ceiling, and she jumped as a mouse scuttled across the wooden floor, disappearing into a hole in the corner where she could see the wood had crumbled. The drapes were threadbare, as were the blankets on the bed, and a thick layer of dust covered the rickety furniture. There was no sign of a washstand, and Molly felt a spurt of annoyance as she sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. The mouse reappeared in the corner, staring boldly at Molly with its button-black eyes. "What a fool I've been," she muttered, looking back at the mouse with a shake of her head. "Owen is not the man he described in his letters, and this is no busy boarding house for genteel young women, which is what he told me. What am I going to do?" The mouse stared for a moment longer, then vanished into the wall again, leaving Molly alone with her worries. She thought back to her life in Boston, but realized there was no point in hankering for the past. She had made her choices, and now she would have to make the best of her situation. "A good night's sleep is what I need. Everything is always better in the morning, so that's where I'll start." As she clambered into bed and pulled the musty blankets up to her chin, Molly wondered whether Owen would be coming up to bed shortly. From the sound of drunken laughter drifting up the stairs, he would certainly not be sober, and part of her hoped he would just leave her alone. After the way he had deceived her about the business, she didn't think she would be able to do her wifely duties without finding out why he had lied to her first. Chapter 8. Molly blinked awake as a finger of morning light filtered through the drapes. It took her a moment to realize where she was, but the scratching of the mouse soon reminded her, and she sat up with a start. The room was exactly as she had left it the night before. Her carpet bag was on the chair, and the door was tightly closed. Owen had not come to her room after all. She felt a ripple of guilt as she admitted to herself that she was pleased about this fact, even though it was not how she'd imagined her marriage would start. Tiptoeing to the window, she opened the drapes and peeked out. The sky was washed with pale pink and yellow streaks as the sun rose in the east, and the trees in the backyard shimmered in the breeze, making her heart lift unexpectedly. What she had seen of Griffin Creek so far was quite delightful and much nicer than the busy streets of Boston. She slipped into her serviceable gray calico dress and quickly braided her hair ready for the day ahead. A sudden rustle outside the bedroom door startled Molly, and she opened it cautiously. Two big brown eyes looked up at her, accompanied by the steady thump of a tail wagging. "Well, hello, you're a sweetheart." Molly bent down to stroke the dog, and he immediately rolled over onto his back, wagging even faster as she tickled him on his belly. "You'd better show me around," Molly chuckled. "Owen didn't tell me he had a dog, but I'm glad of the company." She hurried down the stairs, and the dog stuck to her like a shadow, snuffling the floor in her wake. Once she was downstairs, Molly peered into all of the rooms. There was a dining room and parlor at the front of the house, but both looked unused, with the furniture covered in threadbare sheets, as though the place had been frozen in time. At the back of the house, next to the kitchen she had come through the night before, there was a large room filled with round tables, enough to seat almost 30 people. It seemed to be some sort of saloon, because beyond the tables there was a long bar made of roughly hewn planks, and there were empty glasses littered along its top. Owen was sprawled in an armchair next to the empty fire hearth, snoring loudly. His gut hung over his trousers, and every so often he twitched in his sleep and mumbled something unintelligible. Molly crept away, trying to quash the sense of distaste that hit her like a wave. She knew it was shallow to judge folks by how they looked, and it wasn't the fact that he was older than he'd said that bothered her. But seeing him lying in the chair, stinking of stale liquor, filled her with dread. She had heard plenty of tales about drunken husbands who made their wives' lives a misery, and had always vowed she would never be one of them. "Give me guidance on how to have a happy marriage, Lord." The prayer slipped through her mind, and she realized she needed to see the best in him, rather than be judgmental. She wondered what she could do that would please him upon waking. Hard-working men appreciate good, wholesome food, Cook had always told her. Molly rolled up her sleeves and made a plan. She would cook ham and eggs for Owen's breakfast and make a start on cleaning the dining room and parlor. Clearly, the place needed a woman's touch, and she was determined to return the Cedars to what she guessed had actually been a homey building in its former days. She would also encourage Owen away from the life of drink and gambling he had mistakenly found himself in. He must have done it out of loneliness, Molly reasoned. She would work hard to make him happy and lead him back to living a more godly life. And once he settled down into married life and they had children, she would have the loving marriage she had always longed for. "What the devil are you doing?" "How can I sleep with this racket of clattering pans going on?" Owen glared at Molly from the kitchen doorway an hour later, scratching his sagging belly under his stained shirt. He yawned loudly and shuffled forward. "Good morning, Owen. I made you some breakfast." Molly stopped washing the pans immediately and smiled politely. She retrieved the laden platter of food from the range where she had been keeping it warm until he'd woken up, placing it at the head of the table that she had just finished scrubbing. "Sit down, and I'll pour you a coffee, too. It sounded like you had a late night." Owen grunted and slumped into the chair she had pulled out for him, raking his hands through his hair so it stuck up in all directions. He prodded at the eggs suspiciously with his knife. "I like 'em done proper. None of that fancy stuff you do for the wealthy folks you used to work for." Even though he seemed unimpressed, he shoveled half of the food down quickly and then gulped down the coffee Molly had put next to him. He belched loudly and picked his teeth, letting his gaze wander around the room. "I see you've made a start on cleaning the place up." Molly poured herself a smaller cup of coffee and sat down at the other end of the table. "I hope that's all right, Owen. I thought I'd move on to the parlor next." She stroked the dog's ears and smiled at him. "This little fellow has been following me around all morning. Is he yours? Patch? He's a mean critter. He came with the house, and I ain't had the heart to make him leave." Molly noticed that Patch looked nervous as Owen said his name and pressed himself closer to her legs. "I think he's rather sweet, and he seems to like me. It would be a shame to put him out on the street." "Well, keep him out of my way then," Owen said sullenly. "And don't waste good food on him. We ain't made of money, you know." He chewed the rest of his food silently, making short work of finishing the meal. I was wondering. Molly took another sip of her coffee, not sure how to broach the subject she had been thinking about all morning. You said in your letters that the Cedars was a busy boarding house, but there don't seem to be any guests staying at the moment. Will we start taking guests again soon? Owen harumphed and pushed his empty plate away. Folks are hard to please, always making a fuss about wanting the best of everything. It's hard work running a business like that, and the money ain't great. Is that why you've turned to other avenues of making a living? It sounded very rowdy with all the men drinking and gambling. Perhaps once I've cleaned the house, we can turn it back to what it was meant to be. There are lots of young women traveling west. I expect some of them would need a place to stay. Are you telling me what to do, Molly? Owen's voice was low, but there was no mistaking his anger. I decide what goes on around here, and if you don't like it, that's tough. But we'll never get paying guests if you're running what seems to be little more than a sleazy gambling den and saloon, Molly shot back without thinking. I was led to believe I'd be helping you with a legitimate business, not some sort of house of ill repute. Quit nagging me with all your questions, Owen bellowed, standing up so suddenly that his chair toppled over onto the floor behind him. You're not here to think, woman. You're here to do as you're told. Cooking, cleaning, and serving my customers. However, I see fit. Is that clear? His eyes glittered angrily, and he thumped the table to underline his point, making Patch cower with fear under Molly's dress. Of course, yes, Owen, Molly stuttered. She was so shocked at his mercurial change of mood that she could barely speak. Good. I'm glad we've gotten that clear. There's something else you need to understand. We're short of money, so I expect you to come up with some ideas to contribute. I ain't going to work my fingers to the bone to support you, Molly, and I don't want any noisy, brattish children sucking me dry like leeches either. Molly's mouth gaped open in shock. But we're married, Owen, and you said you wanted a family, children of our own. He gave a humorless laugh. I've changed my mind, Molly. I'll take my pleasures elsewhere with the type of easygoing women who won't nag and whine like you, so you don't need to worry about me visiting you at night. You mean I'm here as little more than a servant and not your wife? You've tricked me, Owen, Molly cried. Would you rather I visited you every night then? Owen snarled, grabbing her shoulder and pulling her close. Molly couldn't help the shudder that coursed through her, and she shook her head. I figured as much, he spat, releasing her again. Think of it as a work arrangement, and be grateful I'm giving you a roof over your head. You can start by taking my horse to the blacksmith's. The stupid creature lost a shoe yesterday, and I ain't got time to do it myself. Tell him I'll settle up when I'm good and ready, and don't take no for an answer. Jonah Fallon is as soft as they come anyway, so he won't mind that I already owe him money. And if he kicks up a fuss, well, just mention my name. That's usually good enough to keep folks in line. With that, he picked up his hat and stomped out of the kitchen and down the garden. Chapter 9. Molly hastily cleaned up the breakfast dishes and then wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, whistling for Patch to come with her. The dog jumped up from where he had been lying under the table and bounced behind her toward the small corral, which was at the far end of the garden. Easy there, Molly crooned. The horse's ears flickered at the sound of her voice, and he came over to the railings, limping slightly on one of his back legs. She slipped the head collar on him and led him out, hoping that the horse would not pick up on the fact that she was nervous. She had never had much cause to be around horses and found their solid bulk intimidating, but not as much as Owen being angry with me. The thought made her stop in her tracks for a moment. It was true, she realized. She had led a sheltered life, working at Wyndham Street all those years, and had never been exposed to the vitriol she had seen in Owen's eyes when she had dared to question him about the gambling and drinking. The way he had bunched his fist and leaned in closer. There was no doubt that he wanted her to be afraid, so that she would do exactly what he demanded. Molly tried to put her troubled thoughts aside so she didn't make any mistakes with the horse. After prancing on the spot next to her as she fumbled with the gates to get him onto the road, he settled down and walked docilely along the edge of the road, seemingly unperturbed by Patch trotting behind. It was still early, but the streets were busy. Wagons rumbled past, laden with a variety of goods, and people bustled toward the town center, intent on getting to work. "Good morning, ma'am." Several men who looked like they might be clerks lifted their hats politely, and Molly smiled back. It made a nice change compared to Boston, which was so crowded she had always felt anonymous. After asking for directions, Molly eventually arrived in front of a cluster of wooden buildings. One was a house surrounded by a pretty garden with roses in full bloom twined around the veranda railings. Next to it, there was a low shed with the doors wide open. She could see a furnace inside glowing bright orange and hear the clanging of metal being beaten. Beyond the shed, there was a large corral with several horses in it, contentedly munching hay. The buildings were set at the very edge of town, and Molly could see rolling green paddocks beyond, with a small lake and a spinney of silver birch trees. It looked idyllic, and she sighed wistfully, thinking how wonderful it would be to live somewhere like that. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The deep voice broke into Molly's daydream, and she jumped guiltily. Owen had told her he knew everyone in town, and she couldn't afford for reports to get back to him that she had been idle. She lifted her hand to shade her eyes against the bright morning sunshine and found herself gazing into a pair of bright blue eyes looking at her with a quizzical expression. "Oh, sorry, I have a horse. There's a problem." Molly stopped as she saw the man's mouth lift at the corner into a slow smile. I can see you have a horse, ma'am. And I reckon the problem is that he's lame on his back near side leg. You'd like me to shoe him, right?" Molly nodded with a wry smile. "You can probably tell I'm not very knowledgeable about horses, miss." "Jonah Fallon, ma'am, but most folks just call me by plain old Jonah. I'm the blacksmith and farrier, and if I'm not mistaken, this is Owen Webb's poor horse. I'm always telling him not to ride him so hard, but he never listens. He's a beautiful animal, but he'll be permanently injured if Owen doesn't treat him better." Jonah frowned as he ran his hand down the horse's leg. It looked slightly swollen, and the horse shifted so as not to put any weight on that hoof. "Owen said it was just a missing shoe that was the problem. Is it something worse?" Molly's face creased with worry as she absent-mindedly stroked the horse's neck to soothe him. "I'll put a poultice on his leg, and I'd like to keep him here for a couple of days. I don't want to put the shoe on straight away in case there's an abscess in his hoof." Jonah smiled at Molly. "You might not think you're confident with horses, ma'am, but you have a good touch, I can tell. See how his ears are forward when you're stroking him? That shows he trusts you. Horses are excellent judges of character," he added with a twinkle in his eyes. Molly felt the blood rush to her cheeks and looked away, hoping that he wouldn't notice her blushing. His kindness was a stark contrast to Owen's harsh words, which were still rattling through her mind. "Pah! Pah!" A young girl suddenly scampered down the veranda steps. She had bouncing golden curls and the same bright blue eyes as Jonah. "Can I help you today, Pa? You promised, and I've put the coffee in the pot ready for you." She skipped over toward them and then stopped to look up at the horse. "Good boy," she crooned. "Pa's gonna make you all better." The horse snickered and bent over to sniff her head before blowing through his nostrils and ruffling her hair, making her giggle. "This is my daughter, Agatha," Jonah said. "Agatha, say hello to the lady, please. I've told you to be polite to my customers, not just the horses." He stifled a chuckle as he caught Molly's eye over Agatha's head. "Good morning, ma'am," Agatha said quickly, giving Molly a quick curtsy. "Pa's just about to have a cup of coffee on the veranda with me. Would you like one too? We've got plenty to spare." She turned back to Jonah. "Is that polite enough, Pa?" she whispered loudly. Molly couldn't help but laugh. "I'd like that very much, but only if you have time to stop. I'm sure you're very busy, and I haven't introduced myself properly. I'm Molly Larkin." She shook hands with Agatha. Sorry, I'm Molly Webb." Her face clouded as she corrected herself. Mr. Webb and I just got married yesterday," she added quietly, looking away quickly. "I met him by correspondence and only arrived from Boston yesterday. I still haven't gotten used to it. Let me just give the horse some hay, and I'll be right over." Jonah led the horse away, and Agatha took hold of Molly's hand, pulling her toward the house. "It's lucky you came," she said. "Pa works so hard, but having you here means he has to be polite and stop to have coffee. You sit here," she added, dragging a third chair to join the 2 wicker seats that were already there. Molly wondered where Agatha's mother was and whether she would join them as well. As if reading her thoughts, Agatha gave Molly a long look. "That's Ma's seat, but I don't mind if you sit on it because you're pretty like she was. She died when I was only 3, but I can still remember her a little bit." She hurried away into the house before Molly had a chance to reply. While she waited, Molly had a chance to look at the garden. Although some of the flower beds were overgrown, she could tell that whoever had created them had done so with care and attention. Drifts of tall flowers nodded in the breeze at the backs of the borders, and low-spreading plants tumbled charmingly over the pathways in between. There was a wooden swing under the tree, and 3 birds chirped loudly as they dust-bathed. Beyond the tree, Molly could see the kitchen garden where tidy rows of vegetables were growing. She imagined what it would be like to stroll out in the morning dew with a basket to pick flowers, and suddenly felt a lump in her throat. "I'll never have that sort of life with Owen. But I'm trapped, married to him, and there's nothing I can do about it." The thought made her stomach lurch with distress, and she blinked back tears, arranging her face into a smile again as she saw Jonah coming up the garden path toward her. "I'm afraid Agatha can get a bit carried away," he said, sitting next to her and stretching his long legs out. He sighed slightly and turned his hat in his hands. "She's been having a hard time of it at school, so I sometimes let her stay home with me. But I wonder whether it's good for her, you know. I used to send her to our neighbors because they had a governess, but they're away for 6 months." Molly nodded. "She certainly seems very bright, and even I can see she has a way with horses. She must get that from you." "She'd be out with the horses all day long if I let her," Jonah chuckled. "I suppose I'll have to persuade her to go back to school when they start up again in the fall and let her work with me meanwhile. She needs to keep up with her reading and writing, though. I don't want her to forget everything she's learned." "I could help her with that." Molly blushed again, wondering why she kept speaking before thinking things through. There was something about Jonah and Agatha that made her feel comfortable enough to speak her mind. "Would you really? That would be a huge help, even if it was just a couple of times a week." "I'd pay you, of course," Jonah added hastily. "If it were up to me, I'd offer to do it for nothing. Agatha is a sweet girl, and I'd like to help." Molly thought back to Owen's harsh words about her needing to contribute an income and plowed on. "The thing is, Mr. Webb is short of money, so I don't think he would let me do it without some sort of payment. I'm sorry." She felt embarrassed, as though she was taking advantage of Jonah's kind nature. "Don't apologize." Jonah shrugged and then smiled. "Owen never seems to have enough money, but I won't let his horses suffer. That's why I fix him up regardless. How about if you teach Agatha 2 mornings a week? Would he be happy with that?" Jonah named a sum of money, and Molly nodded quickly. "I'd like that," she replied. "I used to read for the master of the house where I worked in Boston. He was ill in bed a lot. I brought some of my old books with me, which I think would be perfect for Agatha. I'd better check with Owen first, though. He's very particular about how he likes things done, and I don't want to step out of line. I mean, get things wrong." "Yes," Jonah said slowly. "I can imagine he's kind of demanding." He looked as though he wanted to say more, but the rattle of cups on the tray that Agatha was carrying made him change the subject, and the moment passed much to Molly's relief. The last thing she wanted was to have to explain to her new friends what life was really like at the Cedars. Chapter 10. Molly quickly settled into her new routine at Griffin Creek. Fall came and went, and then it was Christmas. She did what she could to create a sense of cheer, but Owen complained at every turn, telling her to rein in any notions of extravagance with decorations or a celebratory meal. The one bright spot in Molly's new life was teaching Agatha. Much to her surprise, Owen had grudgingly agreed that she could be spared from the household chores to tutor her in reading and writing as long as the money came in every week. He had even said yes when she explained that Agatha would be coming 3 mornings instead of 2. Molly had soon figured out that the way to survive being married to Owen was to melt into the background as much as possible. And if she needed his consent for something, she would wait until he had had his first 2 drinks of the day, as that was when he was at his most agreeable, just drunk enough to be mellow before he tipped into his more usual argumentative demeanor. It was a fine balancing act that left her feeling exhausted, but her pride prevented her from admitting how bad things were to anyone. As the first tentative signs of spring arrived in Griffin Creek, Molly let her thoughts drift as she scrubbed the kitchen floor early one Monday morning. She and Owen had been to church the day before, as usual. It was the one thing they did together. When she had asked him how he could spend his life gambling and drinking, yet still attend church each week, he had scoffed at her. "It's to keep the gossips happy, you silly woman. As long as the well-to-do folks think I'm respectable, and the less law-abiding folks think I'm not to be crossed, I've gotten the best of both worlds." He had tapped the side of his nose with a humorless grin. "Nobody really knows what I'm up to, Molly, and that's just the way I like it." Molly sighed as she dunked her brush in the bucket of hot water and resumed the repetitive scrubbing again. Owen was right about that, she mused. The ladies at church simpered over him when he pretended to be charming to them. But the men who visited the Cedars at night to fritter away their money gambling at the card tables were wary of him, knowing that he was quick to use his fists to settle an argument. And now I have to look the other way with his fancy women as well. Molly pushed a lock of hair out of her eyes, wincing slightly as her wrist caught the latest bruise caused by Owen. He had never hidden the fact that he enjoyed the company of the women of easy virtue who loitered outside the rough saloons in the back streets of town. But lately, he had started bringing some of these women to the Cedars under the guise of it being to please his customers. Thinking back to the giggling she had heard downstairs the night before, Molly felt the sharp sting of humiliation again. How can I hold my head up in town when Owen behaves in this way? The question rattled through her mind, and she realized there was no answer. She would just have to find some way to bear the life she had chosen. She had married him of her own free will, and she was trapped inside a loveless marriage. Patch suddenly jumped up and wagged his tail at the sound of footsteps coming up the garden path. It was Agatha, and she called a cheery greeting as she hurried in. "Sorry I'm early, Molly. Pa had a big new job to start this morning, so I had to do breakfast earlier than usual." "Don't apologize," Molly said, hastily drying the wet floor with a rag so nobody would slip. "Patch and I are always pleased to see you. You know that." Agatha put her arms around Patch's neck and gave him a kiss as his tail thumped enthusiastically. She gave Molly a curious look. "After Pa and I saw you at church yesterday, he told me that you married Mr. Webb because you wrote letters to each other. Is that really true?" she asked innocently. "Yes, well, kind of," Molly replied. She dried her hands and laid some books on the kitchen table. They would start with some Bible study, and then she had planned for Agatha to practice her handwriting and spelling. Agatha's face took on a dreamy expression. "When Pa told me that, I had an amazing idea. I figured that if Mr. Webb married you because of a letter, then Pa could get married to a lovely lady as well after writing some letters. Is that all he needs to do? How would he know which lady to write to?" She peppered Molly with questions, getting more excited by the minute. "It's not quite that simple," Molly said. She tried to change the subject, but Agatha was insistent. "It all starts with an advertisement in a newspaper called the Matrimonial Times." An advertisement? Agatha struggled with the word and shook her head. "I ain't never heard of one of those. How does Pa do that?" "Well, he would write a small advertisement, a description of himself and his situation, and then it would be printed in the newspaper." Molly's curiosity was piqued. Jonah was a good-looking man who could probably have his pick of single women clamoring to walk out with him if they knew he was looking for a second wife. She sipped her coffee and imagined him with a pretty young bride on his arm. The thought made her feel something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Was it disappointment? Or regret? Sipping her coffee again, she told herself she should be happy for him. Whenever she walked Agatha back, he always made a point of putting his tools down and talking with her for a few minutes, and she had the impression that he was lonely. A respectable amount of time had passed since he had been widowed, so it was only natural that he would want to remarry. "I'm not sure Pa would know how to do that." Agatha's chatter snapped Molly out of her thoughts. She gave Molly a wide smile as she opened her Bible. "Would you help Pa write an advertisement, Molly? You're so good with words, and you're his favorite friend. It sure would mean a lot if you could help him get married so I could have a new ma." Molly nodded. "Of course. You've both been so kind and welcoming. It's the least I can do." "That's settled then," Agatha said delightedly. "How about we walk back home a bit earlier than usual today and help Pa do it right away? He'll be ready for lunch by then. You could eat with us, Molly. That would be perfect." Jonah was surprised to see Molly and Agatha back so soon, but couldn't help but smile as he watched them walking toward his workshop. Agatha had blossomed in the months that Molly had been teaching her, to the extent that when she had begged him to let her continue going to the Cedars for tutoring instead of returning to school, he had agreed immediately. When his wife, Noelle, had died from a short but brutal fever 5 years ago, he and Agatha had been heartbroken, and at one point he had wondered whether Agatha would ever get over the nightmares that left her sobbing in her sleep most nights. But gradually, they had become less frequent, and much to his delight, they had stopped completely within a few weeks of her meeting Molly. It was this that had made Jonah realize that Agatha would benefit from having a new ma. Plus, the fact that he'd finally admitted to himself that he was lonesome. Being busy with work was no longer enough to fill the void of the quietness of his house once Agatha went to bed. He wanted a kind-hearted wife by his side to share the simple pleasures of life with. "Pa, Molly says you have to write an advertisement if we want a new ma for me." Agatha ran toward Jonah, with Patch bounding along next to her. "She's going to help us write one today." She tugged at Jonah's hand. "Will you stop work so we can do it right away, Pa?" Jonah nodded, feeling a blush creeping over his cheeks. "Since you told me about how it was the matrimonial times that brought you and Owen together, I've been thinking it's time I did the same. For Agatha's sake, you know?" He wasn't sure why he felt the need to add that last bit, but the words slipped out. "And for yourself, too?" Molly added. They strolled toward the house, and she wondered why he was struggling to meet her eye. "You have to marry someone you love, Jonah. Trust me, if you don't, you'll regret it." Jonah shot her an inquisitive look, but Molly was already walking ahead of him, so he couldn't tell whether she was speaking about her own situation or not. He sighed. Rumors were that Owen Webb was a bully, and now that he'd gotten to know Molly as a good friend, he couldn't help but worry about her being married to him. "What shall we say, then?" Agatha had her pen poised, ready to write before Molly and her pa had even sat down, making them both smile. "Blacksmith seeks a new wife?" Jonah looked awkward and took his knife out to whittle a piece of wood. "Pa, we need to do better than that. We have to say what sort of lady we'd like, don't we?" Agatha smiled at Molly. "I think we should ask for someone just like you, because Pa's been real happy since you became our friend. So we need to say, kind, pretty, makes us smile." She ticked the attributes off with her fingers, making Molly blush. Over the next half hour, Agatha made coffee for them all as Molly helped Jonah define the kind of woman he would like to meet. She wrote and rewrote the advertisement several times until they were all happy with it, and Jonah promised Agatha that he would take it to a Heart's Delight matrimonial agency to go into the newspaper the next time he was in town. "How long do you think it will take, Pa? Will I have a new ma by summer?" Agatha fizzed with excitement at the thought of it. Before Jonah could reply, a wagon suddenly rumbled into view. "It's Hester and John," Molly cried. "Hester's my friend from Boston who I came out here with," she explained. "John is one of my best customers," Jonah said, standing up quickly. What a coincidence. Molly hurried over to see Hester. Even though they had promised to stay in touch, she had only seen her briefly a couple of times since their arrival. Owen had told her in no uncertain terms that he didn't approve of Molly having friends because it would distract her from her chores, so she had reluctantly turned down Hester's invitations. "Molly, what a wonderful surprise to see you here. Jonah told me you're helping Agatha with her reading and writing." Hester clambered down from the wagon and gave her old friend a big hug. "Yes, and she's just helped us to write an advertisement to get me a new ma," Agatha said happily. "I've offered to pay Molly for her troubles, but she won't hear of it," Jonah said with a bashful smile. "It's nothing," Molly said hastily. "My good deed for the day, helping my friends find love and happiness, is the least I can do in return for all your kindness." She felt her heart skip a beat as Jonah gave her a long look that was hard to read. "I'm very pleased for you, Jonah," Hester said with a wide smile. "I can't recommend it highly enough. You only have to look at me and Molly to see what a good idea the matrimonial times is. Both of us happily married, and even more exciting, John and I are expecting our first baby." Molly congratulated Hester and then excused herself, knowing that if she didn't return home very soon, Owen would be in a towering rage and accuse her of being idle. But as she hurried back through the busy streets, her heart felt heavy, and she prayed silently. Hester is so happy in her new life with John, and Jonah will have a lovely new wife soon as well. Please give me the grace to be pleased for them, Lord. She shivered with regret as she considered her future. Agatha would have a new mother and probably return to school soon. Hester would be happily engrossed with her baby and life on the ranch, and Jonah would, quite rightly, be busy building a life with his new bride. Molly stifled a sob as she thought about the long, empty years stretching ahead. She was completely beholden to Owen and his drunken rages and realized she had never felt so alone. Chapter 11. "What's this? Did I say you could buy a new gown?" Owen's face was dark with anger as he snatched at Molly's sprigged muslin dress. "Ain't you been listening to a word I've said? We don't have enough money to keep this place going, let alone wasting it on yourself," he snarled. Molly shrank back. "It was the cheapest one I could find at the second-hand clothing store, Owen. I promise it wasn't expensive. I've mended my other dresses until they're falling apart at the seams." He gave her a scornful look and folded his arms. "Second-hand, huh? Well, that's about all you're worth." "Do you have to be so cruel?" Molly blurted out. She edged around the kitchen to put the table between them. "I hear you with those wretched men every evening. Ned and Robbie. Is it? They're bad company, Owen. I don't think they should come here anymore. I heard someone in town say they're outlaws." "It's none of your business, woman." Owen clenched his fists and scowled, then snatched the whiskey bottle off the dresser, pulling the stopper out and swigging a large mouthful. "I need more money, and they're going to help me get it." He gestured wildly at the house. "I don't want to live in a rundown place like this. I deserve more. My parents were well-to-do before my pa lost it all, the fool that he was. That's why I want to help you make the Cedars nice again, so we can start taking in proper-paying guests," Molly said patiently. She was still clinging to the faint hope that if she could restore their home back to the boarding house it had once been, she might be able to turn their fortunes around, and Owen would stop drinking. "I ain't bothering with that." Owen suddenly grinned, and a sly glint came into his eyes. "Me and Ned and Robbie have got something coming up that's going to make us all very rich." "What are you talking about, Owen? I don't like the sound of that. Not with those two." "Never you mind." Owen took another fortifying swig of whiskey and chuckled to himself. "People underestimate me around these parts. Well, not for much longer." He hiccuped and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'll be going away for a few days later this week. I don't want you seeing anyone while I'm gone, though. Is that clear? Not that hoity-toity friend of yours or anyone from church. Just stay at home." "If that's what you want," Molly muttered, "what if someone comes calling for you? What should I say?" "Just tell him I'm away on business." Owen stepped closer and gripped Molly's shoulder so hard it made her wince. "I'm counting on you not to mess this up for me, Molly. Do you think you can manage that?" She pulled back and cried out as he cuffed her with the back of his hand. Faster than a striking snake. Yes, Owen. I'll do exactly as you say." The ricocheting sound of the door slamming as Owen barged out of the house left Molly feeling stunned. The side of her face ached from his violent assault. It was the hardest he had ever hit her, and she collapsed into the nearest chair, trembling with fear. What is Owen planning? She had so many questions whirring through her mind, but knew there was no point asking him. All it would do is stoke his anger. As the tears trickled down her cheeks, Molly felt Patch's soft nose nuzzling her hand, comforting her. "How will we get through this, boy?" Molly stroked his soft ears and wished with all her heart she had never replied to Owen's advertisement. But then, I would never have come to this quaint town or met Jonah and Agatha. Reflecting on who her real friends were, Molly dried her eyes and took a deep breath. She folded her hands and started to pray. "Dear Lord, I give myself up to you. If Owen is going to do something bad, please, by your grace, show him that there's a better way. And if I am to live the rest of my life with him, please give me your gracious wisdom to find a way to be content." As she drew comfort from the words she whispered, a sudden shaft of sunlight fell across the kitchen floor, and a butterfly fluttered against the window, looking like a jewel. Molly smiled softly, taking it as a sign that her prayers had been heard. She felt clearer now. All she needed to do was bide her time, and the Lord would show her what to do. The next few days passed as normal, and Molly wondered whether Owen had changed his mind. But her hope was short-lived when Owen curtly commanded her to pack up enough food for his journey and informed her he would be leaving after dark. "What about the regular customers?" Molly asked. "Pay no heed to them," Owen said irritably. "You'll be upstairs in bed as normal anyway, and the young boy who helps me serve the drinks will take care of them." Molly busied herself with baking and packed the food into his saddlebag, deciding it was wiser just to let him go without asking any more questions. If anything, the prospect of a few days without jumping to his every demand had lifted her spirits. She had sewing to get on with, and it would give her a chance to clean more of the house without being interrupted. Once Owen had left, Molly hurried upstairs, feeling a huge sense of relief. He had said he would be gone for at least 3 days. She touched her tender cheek where a purple bruise had bloomed from when he had hit her. 3 whole days of not worrying that I might say the wrong thing to attract his anger. She shook her hair out and brushed it slowly, allowing the thought that had taken seed in her mind earlier that day to come to life. "I can't go on living like this," she whispered to her reflection in the small mirror on her dresser. Checking to make sure her bedroom door was firmly closed, Molly folded back the rag rug she had on the floor next to her bed and pulled up the loose floorboard she had discovered when she first arrived. Reaching into the cavity beneath it, she retrieved the silver cufflinks and hairbrush that Henry had given her before hastily hiding them in her apron pocket. "Thank you, Henry," she murmured. "You were wiser than you ever knew, and one day I'll write and thank you." The next morning, Molly rose early so she could get her chores done in good time. For once, the saloon room wasn't too filthy, so she had finished sweeping and scrubbing before it was even 10 o'clock. She ate some leftover cold meat and bread for a hasty meal, washed down with coffee, and then put her oldest shawl on. Next, she arranged her hair so it covered as much of the bruise on her face as possible and tied her bonnet in such a way as to conceal herself. She needed to be as unrecognizable as possible. Owen knew almost everyone in Griffin Creek, but because he rarely let her go out, she hoped that most people wouldn't know who she was. Sticking to the quieter back streets, Molly hurried through town until she arrived at her destination. "You want me to value these, huh?" The bald-headed old man looked at Molly, waiting for her reply. "They ain't stolen, are they?" he added. "No, sir. They were a gift from my parents, who aren't alive anymore." Molly hoped the Lord would forgive her small lie. Fixing a magnifying glass to his eye, the old man examined the items, muttering quietly to himself. "They're good quality," he said eventually. "I can take them off your hands." He named the price he was willing to give for them and handed them back. "My price is good for a week if you need time to think about it, but after that, they might go down in value, so don't leave it too long." Molly nodded and tucked them safely back into her pocket. "Thank you." She lowered her gaze and turned to leave, hoping he wasn't a friend of Owen's. "It's good to have options, ma'am," the man said with a sudden smile that made him look kind, "especially if you need to get away from a bad situation." He opened the door to let her out, staring at her cheek. "Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. Whoever did that to you, he ain't a good man, of that?" I'm quite sure." Molly thanked him again and hurried away, doing her best not to catch anyone's eye. The man's words had given her a sliver of hope. The money wouldn't quite be enough to pay for a railroad fare back to Boston, but she had realized she didn't want to leave. She just wanted to be able to leave Owen and find work. If she was frugal, she would have enough to stay at a cheap boarding house for a week or so. Then she would ask Hester if she and John knew of anywhere she might be able to find work, preferably a live-in job, so she would have her board and lodging covered. As though her thoughts had summoned her, Molly jumped as she suddenly heard Hester's voice. "Molly? Is that you?" Hester was strolling toward her with a basket over her arm. "What a lovely coincidence. I'm worn out from shopping, and I was just going to stop for a cup of tea and some cake. You'll join me, won't you?" Chapter 12. "This is just like old times," Hester said happily as she sank into her chair, grateful to sit down. "Remember when we used to go for tea and cake after church back in Boston?" Molly smiled at the memory as she took her bonnet off. "It feels like a lifetime ago. And Cook's poppy seed cake. I can almost taste it now if I close my eyes." Suddenly, Hester's face dropped, and she leaned across the table. "Is that bruise on your cheek what I think it is?" she whispered, grabbing Molly's hand. "Did Owen do that to you?" "Yes, he did." Molly's eyes filled with tears at the shame of it, and she quickly dabbed them away, giving Hester a rueful look. "Owen isn't the kind-hearted person he portrayed himself to be in his letters, I'm afraid." "What a horrible man. Wait until I tell John. He can't be allowed to get away with this." Hester bristled with indignation. "You mustn't tell anyone. It will only make things worse." Molly shook her head. As much as it was comforting that Hester wanted to support her, she knew Owen would deny it and then take it out on her once they were alone again. "I've decided I'm going to leave him. I don't blame you. But what will you do? Will you go back to Boston? Maybe you could come and live at the ranch with us. I'm sure John won't mind in the slightest. He's the kindest man I've ever met." "That's very generous, but I want to stay here, Hester. I like Griffin Creek. It's just Owen I can't bear to be with. I feel so trapped, but I'd rather be alone and try and make my own way in life than endure his anger every day." Hester looked emotional and rested her hands over her belly. "Are you really sure he won't change, Molly? Perhaps once you have children, he'll come to his senses and behave more decently." "That's never going to happen. He doesn't see me in that way." Molly took a sip of her tea. She was determined not to feel bitter about her situation and gave Hester a smile. "I'm happiest when I'm teaching Agatha. I might ask at the school if I could become a teacher. I know it's not like having my own children, but nobody would want me if I were still married to Owen. If I can't have children of my own, at least I can be around them that way, and maybe I could help out with yours now and again." "Of course, Molly. You're my closest friend, so you'll practically be like an aunt to my children. Don't give up on love altogether, though. You never know what might happen in the future. You might meet a nice gentleman who accepts that you had to leave Owen." The next hour passed pleasantly as Hester told Molly about life on the ranch, and they chatted about the goings-on in town. It served to show Molly how isolated Owen had made her, insisting that she didn't need to make any friends. She realized how much she missed such simple pleasures, and it made her even more determined to find a way to escape his clutches. As the town clock chimed, Hester gathered up her shopping and made Molly promise that she wouldn't do anything rash to put herself in danger, and they parted company. Molly strolled along the street, allowing herself the unexpected luxury of not having to rush back to the Cedars. A pink ribbon caught her eye in the window of Watson's General Store, and she slipped inside to buy it for Agatha with some of the money she had squirreled away without Owen knowing. She would give it to Agatha the following morning when she came for her lessons, and he would be none the wiser. The small act of independence made her smile as she continued her walk home past the park and then the saloon. "Well, howdy, Mrs. Webb. You're looking mighty purty today." The sound of a slurred voice behind her made Molly spin around in surprise. "Pastor Luke? I wasn't expecting to see you." The pastor stumbled closer, followed by another man who was so drunk he could hardly stand up. There was a lustful glint in his eye, and his gaze raked up and down, lingering on her womanly curves. "I'm heading your way, and Owen's out of town at the moment. I could keep you company." He grabbed onto her arm and pulled her close, not caring that it was broad daylight. "Certainly not. That's no way for a man of God to behave." Molly shook him off and stepped hastily backward. "A pastor? A man of God?" The drunken man behind Pastor Luke roared with laughter. "That's the funniest thing I've heard this week." He wiped the tears of mirth from his eyes and then hiccuped loudly. "Shut up, you fool. Shooting your mouth off when it's nothing to do with you." Pastor Luke pushed the man back toward the saloon, giving Molly a nervous glance. "Take no heed of him," he mumbled. "He's had a skinful of whiskey, and he doesn't know right from wrong. Don't tell Owen, and we'll forget it happened." Molly hurried onward, rubbing her arm where he had grabbed it and shaking her head in puzzlement. She had never seen a pastor who looked so disheveled or who behaved in such an ungodly manner. If anything, he looked more like an outlaw, and there was something about his demeanor that didn't seem quite right. She realized that she had never seen him in church since he had married them, which seemed curious, so she decided she would make a few discreet inquiries next Sunday to find out more about him. "This is really for me?" Agatha's face lit up with happiness as she tied the pink ribbon in her hair. "Yes, but you have to promise you won't share it with your pa. I don't think it's his color." Agatha giggled and then threw her arms around Molly. "Thank you. It feels like Christmas." She packed her books away in her basket, singing to herself, while Molly tidied the kitchen. "Will you walk home with me today? Pa was saying it would be nice to see you." Molly felt her spirits lift like they did every time she saw Jonah. His gentle ways were like a soothing balm compared to Owen's vile tempers, and she nodded eagerly. "I baked a cake last night for you both, so that's an excellent idea." As they strolled through town together, Agatha slipped her hand into Molly's as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Skipping along next to her, she pointed out the flowers in everyone's gardens and chattered about Jonah's latest job, which was to make some smart gates for Hester and John's ranch. "I was hoping to see you." Jonah hung up the thick leather apron that he wore to protect himself from the burning metal and washed his hands in the water trough, breaking into a broad smile. "Me too," Molly replied. She held her basket aloft. "I made poppy seed cake." Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced at Jonah, hoping he wouldn't think she was being too forward. His chiseled jaw was covered in stubble, and his blue eyes twinkled with amusement. His shirt was stuck to his broad chest where he had been sweating from working by the furnace, and Molly felt the blood rising to her cheeks as she found herself imagining what it would be like to be held in his muscular arms. "That's my favorite," Jonah declared. "And it's perfect timing because I was stopping for a cup of coffee. I've got something to show you as well," he added mysteriously. "Look what Molly gave me, Pa." Agatha showed off her new ribbon, pirouetting happily in front of them both. "That's very kind." Jonah bowed slightly, and Agatha scampered away to fetch the coffee cups. "I don't know how I would have managed these last few months without you, Molly." He looked suddenly serious. "You don't know what a difference you've made to Agatha. I'm very grateful. I'm very fond of her." Molly followed him through the garden, but instead of going to the veranda, Jonah turned toward the shady area and pointed to a bench that was made of intricately designed metal. "Did you make that? It's wonderful." Jonah nodded. "Uh-huh. I figured it would be a nice place to sit in the evening and look at the garden. Would you try it out for me? I want to make sure it's comfortable, and I'd value your opinion. If you like it, I might make some more to sell." He waited nervously as Molly settled herself onto the seat. "It's perfect, Jonah. You have a great talent." She smiled up at him, and he grinned with relief. "It's meant to be for two people to sit side by side." "I can see what a lovely idea that would be," Molly said carefully. "I could imagine sitting here watching the sunset with a cold glass of lemonade." She patted the space next to her. "You should test it as well, perhaps?" Jonah sat down next to her and gave her a sidelong glance. Although there was a small gap between them, his pulse quickened as he smelt the faint scent of rosewater on her clothes and looked at the way the dappled sunlight glinted on her hair. One coppery curl had escaped and framed her heart-shaped face. He longed to tuck it behind her ear and pull her into his arms. "It seems to fit two people just fine," he muttered. A leaf drifted down from the tree above them, landing on Molly's hand, and without thinking, he brushed it gently off, shivering slightly as their fingers touched. Molly cleared her throat and glanced away. "Have you had any promising replies to your advertisement?" she blurted out. She didn't want to pry, but seeing as she had helped him write the advertisement, she thought it would be polite to ask. "Agatha told me you've had several letters back already," she added hastily. "Did she?" Jonah leaned forward and plucked a weed out of the gravel, avoiding her gaze. "Yes, I've had more replies than I was expecting, to be honest." "That's good. So you'll start corresponding with the one who's appealed to you the most then?" Perhaps. None of them is quite what I'm looking for, that's the problem." He gave a non-committal shrug. "I think I'd rather wait. I have gotten to know someone in town, actually. Oh yes, I expect it's better to meet your new beau that way." Molly felt unexpectedly disappointed. She had known he would get plenty of interested ladies replying to his advertisement, but if he had already met somebody he liked in town, he would probably start courting her sooner than she had anticipated. "I'm happy for you," she said quickly, hoping that he hadn't noticed her hesitation. "It will be nice for Agatha to have a mother figure back in her life." "Yes, it will," Jonah agreed. I'm sure nothing will change for a little while, but I'm hoping and praying Agatha and I will be part of a proper family again sometime." Molly nodded and swallowed the lump in her throat. "I hope so too," she said quietly. "You both deserve it." Silence stretched between them, and a thought crept into her mind. If only it could be me. She gave Jonah a shy smile that he returned. She wished she could share what was in her heart, but knew she couldn't. An upstanding man like Jonah would never want a woman who was already married. She bit her lip, realizing with sudden certainty that she had fallen in love with Jonah, but she could never tell him. Chapter 13. Molly sat bolt upright in her bed, her heart hammering under her nightgown, wondering what had woken her in the middle of the night. There it was again, the sound of dragging and scuffing that had awoken her. She tiptoed across the floor and pressed her ear to the inside of her bedroom door, straining to listen to what was happening beyond. That'll do nicely. She heard Owen's low chuckle and the creak of the door opposite as he closed it firmly. Oh no. There was a clink of metal as he dropped the key, followed by a grunt as he fumbled for it in the darkness. Moments later, his heavy footsteps retreated back down the stairs, and Molly heaved a sigh of relief before returning to her warm bed. She lay awake for a while, wondering where he'd been for the last few days and what he was storing in the house in the dead of night. He always kept that room locked, and the key lived in his study. When she had once offered to clean it, his response had been a tirade of anger, and the promise that if he ever found her prying, he would make her pay for disobeying him. The next time she woke up, the dawn light was filtering through the drapes, and she wondered for a moment whether she had imagined the nighttime goings-on. A clatter from the kitchen downstairs made her realize that Owen was indeed home. "Where's my breakfast, woman?" His angry shout galvanized her into action, and she scrambled to get dressed. "Sorry, Owen. I must have overslept." Molly twisted her hair up and secured it with some hairpins as she hurried into the kitchen. "I'll have your food on the table in just a minute." Her nerves jangled with fear, and she hastily started frying some eggs for him. "You get more disappointing every week," Owen remarked with a sour expression. He yawned loudly, not thanking her for the buttered bread she placed in front of him. Molly suddenly felt her patience evaporate. "I'm tired because of all that noise you were making last night," she said. She flipped the eggs and gave him a defiant stare. "What were you putting in that room that couldn't wait until the morning?" Owen chewed silently, and his eyes narrowed. "And while we're at it, I bumped into Pastor Luke the other day in town. He was blind drunk and seemed to know a lot about your business. Is he even a proper pastor, Owen? There's something not quite right about the way he married us, I reckon, and I want to know." Before Molly could finish her sentence, Owen leaped up and hurled his plate at the wall before slapping her cheek, making her yelp with pain. Black spots danced in her vision, and she shrank away from him. "It's none of your business," he snarled. "Just get on with your chores and keep your nose out of it." With that, he stormed off to his study, leaving Molly shaking with shock as she picked up the pieces of broken crockery off the floor. A few minutes later, there was a tap at the door, and Agatha hurried in, swinging her basket. "I hope you don't mind, Molly, but Pa wondered if I could have a lesson today instead of tomorrow. He's had to go out to John and Hester's ranch to measure up for a job he's doing for them." It's not a good day today, sweetheart," Molly mumbled, trying to keep her face turned away. "Are you hurt?" Agatha's mouth gaped open as she caught sight of the angry red hand mark on Molly's cheek. Her eyes pooled with tears, and she took Molly's hand. "Can I make it better? Just tell me what to do," she whispered, darting a nervous glance at the door to the hallway. Molly shook her head. "I want you to go straight home, Agatha, and don't tell anyone about this, okay? I'll be fine by tomorrow, and we can do your lesson as normal." She shooed Agatha out into the garden quickly, not wanting Owen to know that she'd been. The next few hours passed slowly, and Molly's head whirled with her troubled thoughts. She had never known Owen to be so on edge, and she found herself counting down the hours until she would be able to get back to the relative peace of her bedroom and the blissful escape of sleep. "I have to leave, but when can I do it without him knowing?" she murmured. Molly dusted and scrubbed, hoping the mindless work would soothe her, but every time she heard Owen moving around the house, she felt as though her heart was about to jump out of her chest. "I want dinner early," Owen yelled. "I'm going to the saloon in town later. I've got some business to do." His voice got louder as he tried to find Molly, who was kneeling down cleaning the grate in the front parlor. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the front door. "Mr. Webb, you in there? I need to speak to you." The deep voice had a serious tone, and a second later, there was another louder knock at the door. Molly scrambled to her feet, wondering who it was. She felt a shiver of foreboding, knowing it must be something to do with whatever Owen had been up to. "It's Sheriff Muswell." Owen peered out from his study. His face was pale, and it was the first time Molly had ever seen him look scared. "Answer the door and tell him I've been home every night." He bunched his fist and held it up at Molly to show her she had better do his bidding. "Hello, Sheriff. How can I help you?" Molly opened the door very slightly and pressed her hands together to stop them from shaking as she looked up into his stern gaze. "Howdy, you must be the new maid? There's been a series of stagecoach robberies committed over the last few days. I'd like to speak to Mr. Webb to find out where he's been lately. Is he at home?" Molly's mouth went dry. I'm not the maid," she stuttered. "I'm Mrs. Webb." The sheriff's eyes widened with surprise, but Molly plowed on before she lost her nerve. She was acutely aware that Owen was just out of sight, listening to every word. "Owen is fast asleep at the moment, I'm afraid. He had too much to drink, so you won't be able to wake him." She swallowed and gave him an apologetic smile. "He's just been at home this week, if you need to know. He hasn't been anywhere. We're cleaning the place up to offer rooms to ladies traveling out west, a boarding house for mail-order brides, like I was." She clamped her lips together, mindful that she was starting to gabble because she was nervous. "Uh-huh. So Mr. Webb has been home," Sheriff Muswell repeated slowly, deep in thought. "The last one of the 3 robberies was particularly violent, Mrs. Webb. The ringleader tied up the stagecoach driver and terrorized the travelers. There's a bounty on their heads," he added, speaking clearly to make sure she understood. "I'm gathering my men, and we're going to do a thorough search in town. We think these outlaws might be hiding out somewhere in Griffin Creek." Molly nodded again. "I understand, and I'll let Owen know. If he can help you, I'm sure he'll be happy to." She touched her bruised cheek without thinking and smiled weakly. "Good luck, Sheriff," she added. "Thank you, ma'am. These men are dangerous, and I'm determined to bring him to justice." The sheriff put his hat back on and strode off, jumping nimbly onto his horse and urging him down the street at a brisk trot. "Are you sure he's gone?" Owen sounded hoarse as he stared at Molly with a troubled expression. "Was that what you've been involved with?" Molly demanded, ignoring his question. "Have you and those other so-called friends of yours turned into common thieves, frightening innocent travelers and stealing from them? She put her hands on her hips and gave him a hard stare. "Quit your whining," Owen said, looking sullen. "I'm gonna have to lie low for a while. Put some food together for me, will ya?" He snatched a sack from the scullery and charged up the stairs, taking them two at a time. Molly quickly wrapped up some cold meat, bread, and cheese, adding a couple of apples. Whatever Owen was part of, she just wanted him gone. "Here you are." She handed him the food when he returned. The sack was bulging with items that he'd retrieved from the room upstairs, and he had a crazed gleam of excitement in his eyes that made her feel sick. "Are you enjoying this?" She shook her head in disgust. "You wouldn't understand," Owen cried. "It's me against the law, and you can bet I'm going to win. I'll outrun that stupid sheriff and his men. Just you wait and see. I'll sell these valuables and be rich. They can't prove it was me." He laughed and stuffed everything into his saddlebags, throwing them over his arm. "I'll be back sometime, and if you tell anyone about this, you'll regret it." Molly stood back and watched in silence as Owen ran toward the corral to saddle up his horse. "Good riddance. I hope I never see you again." The thought came from nowhere, and for a split second, she felt bad. But then she imagined how terrified his victims must have been, and suddenly she found herself smiling. "He's gone, Patch. It's just you and me, and we're going to be just fine." The dog nuzzled her hand and wagged as the sound of Owen's horse galloping away gradually grew more distant, until, finally, everything was quiet again. Chapter 14. Molly prowled around the house, finding it hard to settle. She had filled several more hours with the chores for the day, but her thoughts returned constantly to what had happened earlier. She knew she had difficult decisions to make, not least what she should do about Owen. Standing in front of the mirror in the parlor, she looked at her reflection, realizing that if she was going to be true to herself, she had to speak to Sheriff Muswell. "I don't owe Owen my loyalty." The thought made her feel braver. She would report Owen's crimes and take the consequences. At least that way she would know she had done the right thing for the poor souls he had treated so badly. Suddenly, there was another knock at the door. Molly patted her hair and hurried to answer it, wondering if the sheriff had returned already. "Thank goodness you're still here." Jonah stepped into the house with a look of anguish etched on his handsome features. "Agatha's been so upset, and I finally managed to get it out of her what was wrong. She told me Owen had hurt you." "Where is he? I can't stand by and do nothing, knowing what he's done to you." Molly put her hand to her bruised cheek, blushing at the fact that Jonah now knew what sort of life she'd been living. "He's gone," she said simply. Seeing Jonah's concern made her resolve to be strong crumble, and her eyes filled with tears. "The sheriff came. Owen's a wanted man. He's been out robbing stagecoaches. I'm so ashamed of it all. I've decided I can't lie for him. I'm going to report him to the sheriff." Her words came out in gasps between her sobs. "Oh, Molly, you've done nothing wrong," Jonah said vehemently. "You're the kindest, loveliest woman I've ever known. Agatha adores you, and I do too." He stepped closer and looked deep into her eyes. "I've wanted to tell you for so long, but I told myself you were happily married and that we could only ever be friends." "You did?" The beginnings of a smile played on Molly's lips. "I've never been happily married, Jonah. In all honesty, the only happiness I've had since arriving in Griffin Creek has been the time I've spent with you and Agatha." She flushed pink at her confession, then threw caution to the wind. "I've been praying that something would happen to free me from my obligation to Owen." A sudden memory bubbled up in her mind. "But what about the woman you said you've met in town? I thought you had feelings for someone already." I do, Molly. I have feelings for you." Jonah grinned happily at her, drinking in every detail of her deep blue eyes that revealed every emotion in them and her soft curls that framed her face. "When we sat down to write that advertisement together, I realized afterward that my perfect woman, the bride I hoped would write to me, was you all along. That's why none of the replies meant anything to me, because my heart was already given to you, Molly." The air between them pulsed with emotion and longing. "But I'm still a married woman," Molly whispered. "Nothing can change that fact, which means we can't be together, Jonah." She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry. It wouldn't be right. I can't bring shame on you and Agatha, even if being with you is everything I've ever dreamt of. Jonah nodded, looking deflated. I know, and I respect you even more for saying that. I just wish. Before Jonah could say anything more, Patch suddenly bounded past them, barking loudly. Howdy, it's me again. Molly was startled to see Sheriff Muswell appear in the doorway. He lifted his hat. How are you doing, Jonah? Mrs. Webb, I've got some news that I think you're going to want to hear. Molly felt a ripple of unease. Did the sheriff know she was lying? Would he think she was involved too? The thought that she might end up tarnished by Owen's terrible crimes made her feel queasy. Go on, she murmured. You'll be pleased to know that my men captured Mr. Webb a couple of hours ago, and they'll have the other 2 outlaws by the end of the day, too. Owen had a lot of incriminating evidence with him. He'll be found guilty of the crimes, there's no question about it. Molly gasped, releasing the breath which had gotten stuck in her throat. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth earlier, Sheriff Muswell. Owen threatened me. She was determined to come and tell you everything, though, Jonah interjected. Molly's no criminal, I can vouch for that. If she did something wrong, it would have been because she had no choice. I suspected as much. The sheriff nodded and gave Molly a kind smile. I know exactly what kind of man Owen Webb is, a liar and a bully. He rocked forward on his feet, looking slightly awkward. There's something else I need to tell you as well. Oh no, has he done something even worse? Molly closed her eyes briefly, wondering whether his litany of cruelty would ever end. I guess it depends which way you look at it, the sheriff said, glancing at Jonah. Mr. Webb already had a wife when he married you, Miss Larkin. Marion Webb left him about 6 months before you arrived in Griffin Creek. They are still married in the eyes of the law. This means that, unfortunately, you are not and never have been Owen's wife. The man who passed himself off as Pastor Luke is a petty criminal who will do anything for a few coins to buy whiskey. But how did you know? Molly wondered whether she was hearing correctly or if this was all a dream. I was out at John and Hester's ranch recently. John and I go way back, and Hester told me she had concerns about how Owen was treating you. I did a bit of digging and got in touch with Marion Webb. He gestured at the house. Unfortunately, this is her home. She left it because she couldn't bear to be with Owen, and he refused to leave. Now that he's been arrested, she'll likely come back and return it to being the charming guest house it used to be. I'm sure she would let you stay for a while, though, after what you've been through. That's wonderful. Thank you, Sheriff. You have no idea how happy your news has made me. Well, I'm glad. You deserve some happiness, both of you, Sheriff Muswell said with a twinkle in his eye, looking at Jonah as well. I'd better head off now. Gotta make sure Owen's bed ain't too uncomfortable in the jailhouse tonight. He put his hat back on and sauntered away, whistling cheerfully. What were we saying about wishing there was a way we could be together? Molly gave Jonah a mischievous smile. I think the Lord has been listening to our prayers after all, don't you? Jonah nodded, and then, as their eyes locked, he swept Molly into his arms, bending his head and giving her the kiss he had yearned to do for so long. Their lips met in the sweetest moment of passion, setting Molly's heart racing as she finally experienced what real love felt like. Epilogue. Can you believe we've been here over 2 years? Hester paused from cutting the cake she had baked to look at Molly. Boston and Wyndham Street feel like a lifetime ago, don't they? I know. I had a letter from Henry the other day. He told me he and Amelia have just had their 2nd child, and he's taken over the family business completely. They're very happy, but he still misses Mrs. Mallory's cooking. Molly chuckled. Mrs. Mallory is quite insistent that their cook should come and learn how to cook properly under her, but Mrs. Chapman won't hear of it. Part of me misses those days, but I never imagined I'd have such a wonderful life out west when we answered those mail-order bride advertisements. Hester's face took on a dreamy expression, and she winked at Molly. I haven't told John yet, but I'm expecting again. Haven't told me what? We have another baby on the way? John and Jonah ambled into the kitchen together, and John darted forward to smack a kiss on Hester's cheek. Did I hear you right? Hester nodded. Number 3. Early next spring, I reckon. That's wonderful news, Jonah said quickly. I'm so happy for you. Molly gave her oldest friend a hug. We'll both have 3 children. What a blessing. Jonah put his arm around Molly's shoulder and pulled her close. Agatha's minding the twins outside in the garden. Should we check they're all right? Yes, off you go. Hester shooed them away. John will help me take the food out, and we'll call you when the picnic is ready. The ranch hands will be joining us as well to celebrate the end of a good harvest. Why don't you have a stroll through the garden, Molly? Have a look at the beautiful seat your dear husband made for John and me. Jonah tucked Molly's hand into the crook of his arm as they went to the veranda. Hester's told all of their friends about my special benches, he chuckled. I've gotten enough orders to last for months. Quite right, too. You don't realize what a talented blacksmith you are. Molly's gaze softened as she watched her stepdaughter Agatha gently tucking a muslin blanket over Rosie and Albert. She's such a kind-hearted girl, she murmured. In no small part down to you, Molly. Jonah felt his heart swell with gratitude. He and Molly had married within a couple of months of Owen's arrest, and it was as if she had been the key to unlocking his happiness again. Agatha adored her new mother, and he gave thanks every day that Molly had come into their lives. The babies are nearly asleep, Ma, Agatha informed them in a whisper. Is it all right if I sit with them a bit longer? They look so sweet. Molly nodded, giving Agatha's shoulder a squeeze. You're the best big sister to them, Agatha. We'll be back in a moment, and John said he has a new foal to show you. Jonah walked Molly through the garden until they reached the rose arbor. What a beautiful spot for your seat, Molly said. They sat down and looked over the rolling hills at Griffin Creek in the distance. I heard from Sheriff Muswell when I was in town the other day. Owen won't be out of jail anytime soon, and they finally tracked down the last of the people he robbed to return their valuables. That's a relief. Molly rarely thought about those terrible days anymore, but she was glad that Owen had gotten the punishment he deserved. Marion will be glad too. Which reminds me, I must visit her with a little gift to celebrate her new opening for the Cedars. Apparently, the business is doing very well already, what with Griffin Creek becoming so popular for travelers and mail-order brides coming out west. I'm glad you two are friends, Jonah said. You know, your kindness is one of the things that I adore about you, Molly. I always suspected Owen wasn't treating you well, yet you took such care to help Agatha get over losing her ma. And you always wanted the best for me, right down to helping me look for a bride of my own. You said you were doing us a good deed, but I knew there and then that I would wait until somehow we could be together. Molly leaned against Jonah and gazed up into his blue eyes, losing herself in them for a moment before replying. Meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You showed me what real love is, Jonah. I always felt like something was missing, being an orphan. But now the Lord has blessed me with you, Agatha, and our own twin babies. My life is rich beyond measure. Jonah lowered his head and gave Molly a lingering kiss, brushing a lock of hair from her cheek. We're both blessed, my darling. You've made me happier than I could ever have hoped for. I'll always love you, Molly. And I'll always love you too, Molly replied. She smiled happily and rested her head on his shoulder as the leaves above them danced in the breeze, and the scent of roses filled the air. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way, you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.